conclusion of the ancient, the last paragraph.
Okay, let's look at that.
Where he said, what does the millennium signify naturalistically?
Yes.
That modern order is artificial stasis, a becalmed universe frozen or fossilized in contempt of all the natural and psychic forces that are suppressed or deformed by this order. Now, that's quite a mouthful. And I think the week you weren't here, I raised that question and kind of got it answered. And I understood that the millenniums, we are far away from the natural order.
Yes.
Right? Maybe not, because I think we have some, I don't know if you'd call them environmentalists, but like Silent Springs and the lady that looked out for the gorillas and the Greenpeace organization. So there is an element of that. It's just not culture dominant.
Right.
So with that in mind, I don't know if our culture is static and that it's stasis. We've moved away from it. It's just not dominant. But where he said, modernity prides itself on its accelerating turnover of technology, information, and institutions. But what should be revolutionary? Culture, moral perspective, concepts, values, the inherent and intrinsically valid imperatives of creative nature are in truth seized up and mummified among us. And I thought that was very good because I've been following the Elizabeth Holmes trial, and I see her as a millennial. And I don't know if you know who that is, with the company Theranos in Southern California. And she left Stanford. Do you know who she is, Rick? Elizabeth Holmes?
I don't.
Okay, Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford and became an inventor. And she said that you just needed to have a drop of blood from your finger, and that would give you all the answers of all the blood tests that you needed. And she went out and got very, very significant investors, including George Shultz. And and the whole thing was a fraud.
Right.
But she's now on trial for that. But when I look at her, I see what Kenneth is talking about here.
Yes.
In fact, her story is told in a book called Bad Blood. And I think probably either today or tomorrow, they're going to have closing arguments in her trial. So I want to see if the jury finds her guilty of fraud or not. It was millions and millions of dollars.
Right, of course.
So I read this, and in my mind, I thought about the many people that Kenneth's talking about.
Yeah.
The many millennials.
Well, could I say something to that?
Yes.
Go ahead, Phil.
Oh, this Rick's answer. Sorry, Rick.
It's okay.
Well, Rick could answer if he wants.
Go ahead, Phil. You first, and then I'll.
Well, my thought is that the problem with ideas, the world of ideas, of concepts, is that it does produce things, what I would call derivatives. And I did mention this before, that the entire mechanical machine, which is incredibly complex and productive, was produced by just the fundamentals of the lever and the wheel, right? Mm-hmm. The variations. The point is, at what point does derivatives and derivatives on top of derivatives and derivatives on top of that and so forth, at what point does it become so extended as no longer connected to fundamentals?
Right.
That's happening in the market. And I think we are at a point where we have put so much status in the derivatives, the creativity of, let's say, civilization, that we have maybe at a point of busting the supply chain that connects us to the fundamentals. And I think many people are seeing, the millennials are seeing, and I agree with them, that don't you see the destruction of the fundamentals of the planet, right? As you're doing the derivatives. And the derivatives have a lot of market share, right? Lots and lots of market share. So I wonder to what degree people truly believe in another extension of the derivatives versus the fall of the fundamentals. And so I think that is the moment we're caught in, because it seems has been so productive that we're afraid to give it up. But at some point, it might be, even the buildings could be only so high before it collapses. So I think this is the point that we're at. And I think that's why there are many people who are alarmed, like, okay, you build on top of that, that's good. And that's very alluring. But I think we're just at that point.
Yeah, some of the terms that he's using in this final paragraph are loaded terms. Stasis and artificial are both important terms here. He's talking about artificial as a construct of human beings that is designed according to what we decide, our egos, our wills, rather than naturalistic, which wouldn't be the result of a decision, but would be the result of compliance with or aligning with the great forces of the cosmos. Whichever way the great forces are combining to create tension and push things, if we move in alignment with them, then we're in harmony with the world around us. And if we move in opposition to them, then we're not in harmony and we're creating conflict that could result in our own destruction. And so there is this way in which, the ancient order that he's describing here tried, whether it succeeded or not is a whole separate question, but it tried to identify what those core forces were and how to align, society and the individual with them. In the modern order, having gone through first the Christian Revolution and then the modern revolution, we now don't believe that God or nature has any authority. Only human beings getting together in parliaments and deciding has any authority. And so therefore, the deciding factor for what we should do is no longer, what does nature impose upon us and how do we stay in harmony with the cosmos? It now is, what did we all decide to do and how do we align ourselves with that? And whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. And this creates—
It's already been tried.
Yeah, exactly.
It was called the Tower of Babel.
Yes, it's been tried before, but the Babylonians didn't have our awesome powers of industry. We can now try it far more intensely than they ever dreamed of doing it. And
yes, but I would say your powers of industry are feeble.
Well, it doesn't matter if they're feeble or not. In this case, they could be powerful.
Oh, it does matter. It does matter if they're feeble.
Well, what I mean is, it's the problem of if you're digging a hole and your problem is that you need to get out of the hole, whether you dig, feebly or whether you dig profoundly and efficiently, neither of them actually gets you out of the hole. It just gets deeper, right? This is the scenario we've created for ourselves.
Well,
I'm trying to agree with you in a roundabout way.
The question is whether you have the energy to get out of the hole you've dug.
And do you even know you're in a hole? Do you think that, this is why Kenneth Smith loves to quote the Kafka line, "We are digging the pit of Babel," where, we think that we're building a tower and rising, while what's actually happening is that we're nesting ourselves more and more deeply in this artificial stasis, aligning ourselves.
We're burning up fossil energy to dig a hole.
Right.
Eventually, that fossil energy, the degree of fossil ores which are available in nature, will reduce in quantity. And we'll be down the bottom of the hole, suddenly realise we don't even have enough energy or mass to produce a ladder to climb out of the hole. I could see that 12, 15 years ago when I did my studying of these matters. People think that some magical technology is going to come along that's going to save them. If it doesn't, you're down a hole with no way out.
Right. And this is where the second part of the phrase, the stasis part, comes into play. The artifice is that we're, instead of aligning ourselves with, whatever's actually going on in the cosmos, we're aligning ourselves with what we've decided to do. And therefore it has this arbitrary quality where it's increasingly misaligned with the things that really matter. The stasis part comes because the way we go about this is not the way that a living vital organism does, where it's attuned to its environment and constantly adjusting. And that forces it into a dynamism, a flow of nature in which the present is incredibly important. You have to know whether the tiger's approaching. If the tiger is approaching, you have to drop your other priorities and focus on the tiger. What happens in our artificial world is, as we grow more and more disconnected from the principles around us, as we get more and more aligned to the history of our own decision making, what happens is we lose the sense of urgency of the present moment, the need to attend closely to the present in order to keep that alignment, because the world that we're aligning to doesn't know what the present looks like anyway. We're living increasingly in sort of a timeless bubble of artificial creation, and that causes us not to respond urgently to things that are urgent because we can't detect that they're urgent. And that's what Stephen's talking about. As we dig the hole and create this energy crisis for ourselves that we don't know whether or not we can dig out of, most of us don't notice. The way that our lives have been structured disconnects us from those essentials to such an extreme degree that we're sort of living in a timeless floating present that blocks us from being able to be sensitive to the environment and respond to it and be, alive in that sense that Nietzsche said we needed to be alive, where we're vital and we're connected. And so that's what the meaning is of saying artificial and stasis both, is that it's creating this culture bubble. But where most culture bubbles traditionally were at least in many ways tied to nature in order to survive, ours is disconnected from nature to an increasing extent. And it's our very powers of technology and reason that have enabled this disconnect and this large bubble. I think it's Gilbert Murray who has a quote that Kenneth Smith likes to quote a lot, that says, the modern orderly societies have created a world in which people with no particular skills or understanding are nevertheless able to live ordinary, seemingly sane lives without actually having any idea what's going on. And that less effective past epochs couldn't do that. And as a result, people were more exposed to nature and they had to ground themselves more than we do. We have this ability to become ungrounded and lost in this artificial, static anti-culture we've created. So that's what he's getting at here in this opening, is he's trying to say that if you were an ancient, you would look at the modern order from a naturalistic perspective. And in that view, you would be shocked by how artificial our lives are and by how static they are, how we don't seem to adapt ourselves to what's actually urgent or happening. Sharon, go ahead. And then Phil, then Colleen, then Brett.
So I thought it was very interesting that he gave this critique on us millennials just before he moved on to the medievals. Because here, the medievals, here was a culture that was dissatisfied probably in very different ways than the millennials are, and they modified themselves. So I thought this was a nice segue. I just needed a little more clarification on it. So the ancients became medieval because I think I read it, the social and political occurrences that were happening around them. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I thought that it had to do a lot with the fall of the Roman Empire.
With the fall of the Roman Empire, but also with the corruption of the late Roman Empire, which got so bad that people lost faith in the entire premise of the ancient worldview. They're like, if people can be this corrupt, then it's not true that nature will compel us to make good governments and good societies. That we can't trust nature to frame us within justice and healthiness. And therefore we need something else. We need something purer and cleaner. And that's why they wanted God to run the world, wanted God to run governments. Because they said, at least the Christian God is perfect and uncontaminatable and is all powerful and all seeing. And therefore he can keep us in line and make us be good. That was what caused the medieval revolution, is the loss of faith in the naturalistic world order and the reaching out for what they thought was the best alternative, which would be perfection and purity. And, you know, if only God would just run our governments and things for us, then we could avoid the corruption. And that's why Augustine calls his book The City of God, in direct opposition to Rome as the epitome of the city of man. He's saying man has proven himself through the ancient epoch to be so corruptible, and we need something incorruptible to hold up in opposition to it. And that will be our way of escaping the endless cycles of corruption and, you know, and evil that we saw under Rome. And that's his whole premise. And that's, I guess you'd say that's, you know, on the one hand, the fall of Rome seemed to put a exclamation point at the end of the ancient epoch. Mm-hmm. But then, like we talked about last week, the flip side of it is that the fall of Rome was caused by the fact that this was the first time when the barbarians came and trashed Rome that the population, instead of saying, and now we'll rebuild it, said, who cares? We've lost all faith in it. We don't believe anymore in the old promises, and so we're going to go a new way. It's not worth trying to get back to where we were. Yeah, good points. Phil, and then Colleen, and Brett. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, this is a nice transition to what I wanted to say, because it's important to parse out the transition a little bit more. You know, Plato had his forms, and, you know, Aristotle was saying, well, you know, like, you can't just reject the earth, that you have to, like, also check on how it is relation. So I don't think he actually gave up Plato. He just wanted to add it to Plato, right? So he had both the ideas and the manifestation as the way to bridge Plato into the world. And I think, you know, Aristotle was a teacher of Alexander. It was kind of important.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Alexander expanded, in a sense, the city-states into an empire.
Right.
Kind of almost the first empire. And he took the idea that on the one hand, you should let the locals alone, and as long as you have a superstructure on top of it to rule it, you could have a kind of semi-flexible empire, right?
Right.
And so Rome learned from the Ptolemaic universe and say, oh, wait a minute, we could do that too. Except then, of course, and then it transformed into Augustus, Julius, and then Augustus, who says, you know, the story is the thing. We will dominate the story and actually, in a sense, suppress the localities more and more. And that's when Augustine came in and say, hey, you know, that's a good idea. You know, like, except now we're going to create a dual world in which, you know, Christ says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, the earthly stuff, mm-hmm. and render unto God that which is God, the more ideal stuff. And mm-hmm. so, of course, when Rome fell, and then of course, the ideals are left, except this is now a spiritual idea, rather, because Augustine was the one that transformed Plato's forms, aspirations, into the mind of God, right? So there was a kind of synthesis. And so therefore you could say, there is Plato actually calling for these, for the mind of God.
Yes.
Right? And so therefore you have the structure that was sort of built into this tradition of transition that was important. And of course, when Rome fell, then of course, the mind of God took over. I mean, it's just like, because, and you know, and Charlemagne tried to recuperate that by becoming the new Rome. But, you know, and that's why you have the duality existing until Napoleon crowned it himself and said, hell with the archbishop, right? And so that's when man then took over from God, because we could actually eliminate God now and just be man controlling everything. So I think that transition is important to know. It's not only a break, but it was a transition that took place. Right. And I think what's his name? The conqueror, you know, he was very, very important in terms of like establishing that relationship between the force on top and the multi-forces below, and then transition into the singular force.
Thank you.
So that'll bring us to the medieval. That's what I want to say about how we got to the medieval and how it became dominant.
Yes.
Can I just read from the passage for 1 second, Rick?
Oh, sure. And then we'll get to the rest
well,
of the
I was just, it's just emphasizing what Phil said.
Yes.
It says, it's in the first couple of sentences, says the gods of the ancients had been themselves subject to the overpowering order of nature, of birth, lust, natural character, and all the other vices that proto-Christian Plato reviled for them. That's what he just said.
Yes.
Christianity, for the first time, conceived a God obligated to be holy or transcendent over such natural flux, a spiritual God, radically self-conceived, a God obligated to be holy or transcendent over such natural flux. And then he goes on to talk about the logos, or the system of order that they assign to this God.
Yes. Yes, and the critical word in that clause is his logos, not nature's logos, right? Because the ancient gods were bound by the logos of nature, and maybe they embodied it, but they didn't define it. It wasn't their will. It was nature's will that made them be divine. But part of the revolution into the medieval epoch is the notion of a God transcendent over nature. Instead of nature being over the gods, God's over the nature, and it's his logos, not nature's logos. It's part of why it's so hard for moderns to read the ancient Greeks in the sense they made, because a term like logos appears and we read it from a Christian perspective, because it's all over the book of John and elsewhere. We assume.
Thank you for the interruption. Thank you.
Yeah, we assume we're talking about a Christian logos, but of course the ancients meant the other kind of logos, the logos of nature, where meaning is immanent in nature rather than transcendent over nature. So that break that happened to cause the medieval revolution, like we've talked about in the last few weeks, was so complete that it completely upended our notions of meaning and time and space. And we're going to come back to this over and over as we talk about the medieval epoch, the ways in which everything that mattered was redefined as the opposite of what the previous epoch had defined them as. It was not just little adjustments that were made. That this is part of why we can talk about it being a revolution, even though it doesn't happen at a single moment, even though it's a transition. By the time that we're well into the medieval epoch, things have changed at such a profound level that the ancient authors are almost unintelligible now to the medievals. They can't read them the way that they were meant to be read. All the fundamental terms have been redefined. Colleen, then Brett, then Stephen. Go ahead, Colleen. You got to come off mute, though.
Okay, I just wanted to respond to something that you had said about urgency. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
About urgency, what you said about urgency, and kind of recognizing when something is urgent, and that perhaps your life is kind of on hold, or actually being able to live freely and without fear. It's all that's on hold until a person becomes very aware.
Yes.
Very aware of your own agency and what little power that you actually do have to kind of clean up your own corner.
Right.
And I think that's going to happen before people can really come together to create a new world.
Right.
That we can all recognize, hey, we're in this together.
Yes.
And we're creating something new. And there are signs out there that some good things are happening. And I know everybody's noticed that.
Yeah.
That people are are recognizing the need for self-awareness and doing various practices and trying to get to, actually, I was going to say also that we are part of nature. Nature is in us and we are in nature, but I think maybe from what you say about an artificial kind of life is we don't see, it's hard to see that or to even experience it as something real. And it's not enough just to have a backyard garden or something like that, or to go out and look at butterflies. So that's all I'm going to say right now.
Yeah, it's what's interesting is that although we are animals and we've evolved within the domain of nature and we're subject to nature, as Kafka says in The Contest Between Yourself and the World, back the world, because we don't get to dictate terms to nature, right? We're part of it. And yet we have this capacity, we have this drive for culture. We have this need for culture to finish the picture of any given human being. And a culture can be more or less adaptive. It can plug us more into nature if it's a healthy culture so that we understand and are alert and sensitive to the things that matter, or it can be an anti-culture that disconnects us from the things that matter and plugs us into things that don't matter so that we're obsessed with the wrong things and we focus on the wrong things. It can do either one. There's this enormous variability in this kind of animal that we are because of the role that culture plays in finishing us. And that was something the Greeks wrote about a lot, the concept of anthropoculture, what a culture is good for is helping to fill in the human animal to create a good animal rather than a bad animal.
And I can see that that's good because that's where our creativity can really come into play.
Yes.
And we are creative beings, and that's not going to stop. But it just seems like some people I have felt a lot in my life that I've become a spectator watching other people do the great things. And I can see where that's however small a scale your creativity is on, there's got to be you can't be, once you become a spectator, then that's not living.
Right. You want to be engaged.
Yeah, that's not really living.
Yeah. Thanks, Colleen. Brett and then Stephen. Go ahead, Brett.
Hey, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine.
Awesome. This is my first time. Thanks for putting this together. It's very interesting.
Welcome.
I do apologize. I don't have the text in front of me, so I'm kind of drinking from the fire hose here.
Sure.
But the digging hole paradox was really interesting to me. And then the comments about, do we have the energy to even come out, I think by Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
But what struck me is it's not obvious that there's a unified desire to get out of the hole.
Right. Right. Or even necessarily an awareness that we're in the hole.
Right.
Yeah.
It's that kind of an analogy you've heard where it's people distracted by their phones. They know it's a distraction, but it's almost easier to just continue to look at the phone than to peer out how painful everything else can be.
Yeah, and the phone acts as a metaphor for, even before the phone, all the other things that our modern anti-culture offers us as ways to look away from the world and the things that matter. That when newspapers were mass production of newspapers happened, late 19th century, there were all kinds of editorials written about the evils of the newspaper and how people weren't talking to each other anymore, and they were sitting side by side on the trains and trolleys, and they were looking at their newspapers instead of each other or the world, and that everything was going to come to an end because of the newspaper. And before that, it was the novel. And on the one hand, you can take from these things that, okay, well, maybe this isn't the catastrophe that we think it is. But on the other hand, what you can take from it is that there is a pattern in the modern world, that we're constantly being offered highly incentivizing opportunities, perverse incentives, you might say, to drive us to look away from the things that matter, to get lost within the culture bubble that we're creating for ourselves. And the advantage of doing that is, as long as we're not looking at the things that matter, it's easy then for people to manipulate the things that matter, because none of us are paying attention. It's part of the architecture of the modern epoch. How do you get enormous numbers of people all pointing in the same direction at the same time in a way that was never possible before at this kind of scale in history? Sort of an industrialization of the manufacture of consent. And that's, in some ways, kind of I would say the beating heart, but really I want to say the mechanical heart of the modern order is that leverage to bust us loose from caring about the things that other people want to change.
The infrastructure is there, the tools are there. It's just
right.
And what better time? Everybody's got a phone in their hand and access to information. It's just there's no unity.
Right. Thanks, Brett. Stephen and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, the question rose for me years ago about, I'll probably define the Greco-Romans as Western civilization Mark I. It collapsed, and now we're in Western civilization Mark II. Now, this is interesting, this dichotomy of the Occidental and the Oriental, and certainly there were material advances in the Orient in the meantime. But the rise, the resurrection of Western civilization has that spectacular quality that we've seen again. So we see the early age of the Greeks, and although all across the old world we see a sort of a rise of culture, which was defined as the axial age.
Right.
It happens in a spectacular fashion among the Greeks, to the point where the Greeks invaded India,
right,
and gave the Indians the basis of a grander civilization. And the Indians went on. The Indians, for example, were probably one of the most advanced cultures by the end of the Middle Ages. But their rise had been kicked off by the Greeks, the Greek knowledge. But yeah, this present Western civilization has arisen, and the whole thing was Rome ran out of resources. It ran out of surface resources. It retreated, even where there were some resources on the peripheries. Mm-hmm. They retreated rather than fight. The whole thing was that we do know now there were technological answers to the fall of Western civilization Mark I.
Right.
They simply didn't find them. They didn't have the will to find them. And it's mysterious how, 700 years after the fall, that the technological answers started to appear. That is the production of iron and steel with the blast furnace of a new variety. But this is the thing, they had answers. Western civilization Mark I had answers that they chose not to find. It's incredible. Well, I won't use the word incredible, but you see that late defining stage of the Roman Empire, and yet a few centuries later, a barbarian empire rises, the Frankish kingdoms, which is rising.
Right.
Where the Romans couldn't, they had failed.
Right.
They had left everything in the hands of the church.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
They had given up.
Exactly. Yeah, it's I guess in chapter 4 of Gilbert Murray's 5 Stages of Greek Religion that he titles The Loss of Nerve. he says, there came a point where they just, the great courage and ambitiousness of the ancient epoch gave up. And as you say, there were many answers right at hand to solve their problems, but they just didn't reach out for them because their faith in their entire approach had failed. And instead of an existentialist approach to life, they wanted an escapist approach. They wanted a way out instead of to keep fighting. And the medieval revolution offered that to them. It offered them the promise of an end to the grind. God will fix all your problems, and none of this really matters anyway because you'll go to heaven and all your problems will be fixed there. And that was like a huge relief, to all the people who had struggled under generations of corrupt provincial governors. And
in particular, this God is all powerful.
Right.
It's got a 100% guarantee.
Exactly.
Finally, your
can
questions will be answered. 100% guarantee, no problem.
Exactly. You don't have to worry anymore. Good news. This is another thing that Kenneth Smith says. He says it's ironic that there was that period where the Bible was passed around as being called the good news, because he says, the problem is the place where you hear, hey, I've got good news for you the most often is in scams. The Nigerian prince has good news. All you have to do is give him your bank account number and you'll be a millionaire. And if you go to the carnival barkers, they have good news. You can win this giant teddy bear. All you have to do is give them a buck and throw these rings. And it's the same thing with people who are about to sell you the Brooklyn Bridge. There's a funk song by the Brides of Funkenstein called Never Buy Texas from a Cowboy. It's a 15-minute funk epic about, the importance of having, you don't need a big education, they say in the song, you just need the basic mother wit to understand when somebody is offering you something that's too good to be true, there must be some profit in it for them and some big loss for you if you accept, and you got to watch out for it. But there comes a point when people are just culturally and psychologically exhausted and they're just tired of fighting anymore and they just want an easy answer. And part of the way that works is, as each of these epochs, the ancient, the medieval, the modern, goes on from its origins, it gets more sophisticated. It has time to build on its past successes and add new elements. And whether that takes the form of a great kind of complex organism or ecosystem, like it did in ancient traditional epochs, or whether, as in the modern one, it becomes a great...
What was the name of that funk song?
Never Buy Texas from a Cowboy. It's by the Brides of Funkenstein. I'll put that. And the song also references the Brooklyn Bridge. Don't buy a bridge when you're in Brooklyn. Let me just type that in. They were part of the Parliament Funkadelic cycle, and it's one of the bands in which Parliament Funkadelic took their backing singers and made them the leads, and then George Clinton and all the rest of them became the backing musicians behind them. So there's amazing music going on underneath this stuff. So anyway, but the point of this is that late in an epoch. In the beginning of an epoch, the whole premise of the epoch can seem fragile, right? So like when Pico della Mirandola is writing his essay on the dignity of man, at that time, the church seemed all powerful all around him, the medieval church specifically. And the institutions of medievalism seem all powerful. And there's witch hunts going on and everything. It's like, it is in those most unpromising moments that he's writing the premise that what if, instead of relying on nature or God, what if we decided for ourselves? What if we got together in groups and just decided what we thought was right, and then we worked to make it happen? And it seems absurd. Modernism, the idea of a modernism in that context seems like a candle in the wind. But by the time you get to where we are, deep into the modern epoch, modernism seems like an omnipotent machine that's unstoppable. It sees everything, it knows everything, it's everywhere. There's layers upon layers upon layers of corruption and vested interests. It's like, how could you possibly dislodge this? And that's what it was like in the late Roman Empire. yeah, everybody was frustrated. Everybody had lost faith, but they also couldn't see any way out because Rome was so sophisticated in its reach and its systems of control that the premise that why don't we just give up on all this and put our hands, put our trust in God's hands, it again seemed like an absurd, ridiculous, fragile hope. But the nature of the development of the epoch that followed is successes built upon successes until by the end of the medieval epoch, it seemed all powerful at exactly the time that it also seemed all corrupt. This is the irony of these three epochs and how they've developed. Phil, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, I like what Stephen said about the inverse Tower of Babel. I mean, the big hole, and that dovetails with my concept of eco 2 has become very powerful and very real, that we can't seem to get out of it, and that relates to the do people really want to get out of the hole, let alone being able to? Okay, and I think eco 2 has a kind of domination in that sense because, yeah, maybe we don't have the 100% guarantee of God, as Stephen said, but we have kind of a 99% guarantee of the Federal Reserve Bank.
Right.
Right. I mean, okay, there's a 1% difference. We'll call that inflation. But nonetheless, and I want to say, whether you want to get out of the hole depends on two underground animals. This is a metaphor.
Yeah.
The mole, who doesn't get out, and the shrew, who sticks his head up once in a while and say, well, wait a minute, there's something going on there, right? And the mole, of course, is the secret agent, right? That in fact, to be a mole, you have to be a double agent, right? In some sense, metaphorically, in terms of culture, and it's a double agent that does the work that in a sense undermines the offensive of the other side, right?
Right.
Because he's playing both sides. So I think the fact is that we are now underground and people are not getting out because there are a bunch of moles, double agents, preventing us from going out and be the shrew that we ought to be and stick our head up above, and who knows, I guess maybe it is dangerous also to stick your head because who knows, a wolf might come along and whack it off. But nonetheless, I think that's where we're stuck at. So if you want to use the underground thing, whether you want to get out, think about the mole and the shrew. Do you want to be a shrew or do you want to be a mole? Because if you're going to be a mole, you will be a double agent.
Yeah, I like that analogy. It's first of all, it invokes Kafka's The Burrow, which is a short, unfinished fragment that's just brilliant. His portrayal of the psychology of a mole who is sure that the whole world wants to take his stuff. And meanwhile, the world has no idea he's under there. But he lives his entire life in paranoia and worry and fretting. He's constantly digging new burrows, further tunnels with little escape holes, and then running back to his old ones, which he thought were safe, but now he doesn't think they're safe. So he moves all his tubers and roots that he thinks everybody wants down into the even more secret location. He works harder to hide his entrance. And then one day he's not sure, maybe somebody saw him and now he can't trust that entrance. And so he disguises it and goes and digs a different one. He's like, his whole life is focused on this world that he thinks everybody else is part of. And he has no conception that, there is a completely different way to live. He doesn't have to live constantly in fear, but he can't imagine it. It's just inconceivable to him. And that idea of the shrew who can understand that there's two worlds, the world that we're comfortable with, and then a new world of possibilities that makes us uncomfortable, but offers more possibilities. That's that thing that calls for an amphibious life, the philosophical life, where instead of being a symptom of a single worldview, you become someone who possesses multiple worldviews and you can modulate between them. And thus you're more than just a symptom. You're making choices about how to look at things, and that those choices offer you new possibilities for thinking about what to do and what to create. This is the Kenneth Smithian proposition in a nutshell, that what we want to learn how to do is not how to be like an academic who has sorted out other people's philosophies as caricatures so that they seem to be inferior to his own preferred philosophy, which is what most people do when they engage in philosophy at all. They pick a favorite, they exalt it, and then all the others they learn to summarize as some kind of inferior caricature of itself in order to prove that the one that they love is better. And what Kenneth Smith says is, no, that's nonsense. What you got to learn to do is to adopt each of these perspectives in its own terms, in its best, strongest perspective, so that you can move back and forth between seeing honestly from each of these perspectives, because each of them sees something the other one doesn't. And that's why we're doing these 3 epochs. If we can break free of modern or medieval preconceptions about the ancient world and learn to see from the ancient perspective in its own terms, not fully because we aren't ancients, but as close as we can get, then we create more distance between the perspective we grew up with and this new possibility for a way of looking at things. And the greater the distance, the greater the parallax and triangulation that's possible. And so it doesn't matter that we're not able to fully recreate the ancient perspective. It matters that we're able to recreate it enough that it's far away from the one that we started with, and we start to see things differently. And so what he's offering here is, let's get 3 perspectives, because these 3 are all documented. We have writings about all of them. If we work at it, we can work to see things from, Stephen talks about, the 2 modes of European civilization, but what Kenneth is offering is 3, and saying that you can learn to use any one of these perspectives and immerse yourself in it and reinterpret everything from that perspective and say, well, what would Augustine say? What would Aquinas say about a subject? And then, having worked that out, step out of it and then go walk over into the past and say, well, okay, keeping that in mind, what would Heraclitus say? And what's the differences between these perspectives and why? And then compare that to what your own native reaction was, what you thought was the only way to see things before you learned to do this. And what it does is it offers us the best possible antidote to the great flaw of the finitude of the human mind, which is that we assume we are accurately seeing things the way they really are. Until we learn to do this, to shift modes, we think, our worldview is all encompassing and insists that it's complete. And it's not until we realize that there are other worldviews and that they see things differently that we can finally understand that our native perspective is not complete, that it is finite, that it's trying to describe an effectively infinite world in finite terms, and that necessarily that means it's going to be like a funhouse mirror. And that knowing that, we get the possibility of treating our own opinions with skepticism, knowing that they're going to be inadequate, knowing that we need to search outside ourselves. So all of this is kind of core to it. That's the real project of this book. This book is doing this from this one angle, saying if we philosophically study the history of these worldviews, it will help us to get free of the labyrinth that we were born into of our own one perspective, which seems so complete. So these questions of transition, how do you get from the ancient epoch to the medieval epoch? How did that happen and why did that happen? We'll explore that a lot in this book. He's really going to dig into that. Here, he starts the discussion of the medieval epoch, not with the transition, although he talks about it a bit in the section before, but more with the direct contrasts. He just sets up the direct opposites so that we can see them. He says, the medieval Christian worldview arose on contrary premises of a God who was above and apart from nature, right? Which is the opposite of the ancient worldview, in which the gods are within and part of nature. Nature's preeminent. And then he says, and who created this world out of nothing pre-existing. And as we talked about in past weeks, that's a critically important component of the medieval worldview, because if you create from existing matter, the Greek term hule, the matter itself has a lawfulness that imposes limitations on what you can do with it. To be a great potter, you can't treat it like wood. To be a great potter, you can't treat it like metal. You have to know that it's clay. You have to know what clay will and won't do. There's certain kinds of things you can make and certain kinds of things you can't make. And if you try to make things you can't make out of clay, you're going to screw up. And the Christians, to take a step back, the ancients recognized that and said that each of their divinities had their weaknesses and limitations. Each one only represented one cosmic principle. And that's why you needed a pantheon of them set against each other to get the perspectives on the whole cosmos. But the medieval response, the way they did their revolution, is your gods are too small. They're too tiny because they're bound by the matter of the cosmos. They only make things out of what's already there, like man fashioned from the clay. In certain versions of ancient myths, they said our God is better than that. He pre-exists the cosmos. He can make things out of nothing. Ex nihilo, he can make whatever he wants according to his own logos or designs. And as a result, he has no limitations imposed on him by the forms of things. So what we have is not just a God who is free from the limitations of nature, but a profoundly anti-natural God. He is directly, the things that make him tick are the opposite of what makes everything else tick. Everything else is bound by the lawfulness of nature, but not him. And even the lawfulness of nature comes from him in a way that's impossible for anybody, for any of the rest of us to do. He's a kind of creator in a way no human being has ever been a creator, because we're all bound by our nature when we create, but he wasn't. He has this infinite creativity. And in this way, the medievals won their arguments with the ancient theologians, because the ancient theologians had to admit that their gods were bounded and limited. And so if a God like the Christian God existed, well, then he would be greater and more powerful.
You're going to keep your faith in four, or the God which is all powerful. Four might be powerful, but he's limited.
Exactly.
How can you pass up the absolute 100% all-powerful God? Here, come and buy my God.
Exactly.
It's everything you could possibly have. It slices potatoes.
Yes. And what you've just done there is so important, because it shows how in the modern world, the marketplace borrowed and took hold from the medieval arguments, those same ways of winning arguments, but applied them to making money instead of to winning theological arguments, right? My computer is better than your computer because it's quantum. Why wouldn't you want a quantum computer? Yours is, you have a finite computer. My computer can do these amazing magic tricks. Oh yeah, well, my computer doesn't even need a CD-ROM drive. It can just work off the magic of the internet. I have an internet computer. So these same kinds of arguments you're talking about, they all trace their roots back to these arguments that the medieval theologians used to win in the revolution of ideas.
Well, it's what the caveman said in the comedy skit. Does stone suddenly not work all of a sudden when bronze came along?
Right. One of the really interesting features of the early Copper Age is that the first copper axes that were made in imitation of the stone axes, and they had all kinds of features on them that weren't necessary for a copper axe, but it was because they had to win a place in a culture that expected an axe to look a certain way. And if you wanted them to use your new copper shiny axes, they better look exactly like the original stone axes, right down to the beveling on the edges where they would have been napped if they were stone, except they weren't because they're copper. This conservatism and carryover of these old arguments. So Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of somewhat disagree with that view. I mean, the all-powerful God, because like I think you all. I'm going back to Hegel. You know, he hated the word synthesis because he think of it as a layering that retains at least features of the past that you go look through, and so it's more like a collage in a way, in which the whole maybe is a dominant feature, because the Christianity do have these reduced gods to what we call saints, right? There are a lot of, you're not quite gods, but you're saints, and they had to live with that in that sense. In the same way that in a modern culture, we may have a dominant point of view, but we have a lot of diversity that also exists that didn't totally go away. I mean, we try to put them away, but they didn't go away. And they are always sort of bubbling up to a certain degree. So it's never a pure, it's always a kind of alloy. It's never a pure synthesis of sorts. And so I think maybe by putting it into this sort of dominant view might, in a sense, lose some of the layering that is important in terms of, let's say, let's just get to the main categories of these three, but there are actually layers and layers, and some of them do pass away because we have actually managed to crush them. But nonetheless, there are others that exist, and they are alternative voices that are smaller than the Almighty God, but nonetheless, they do speak for a lot of people, and so therefore you have to include them, right? So Alexander's empire still exists to a certain degree, right?
Right. Right. You know, and this is important because one of the themes we've talked about is the bicameral mind, and how we've got the capacity for gnosis and the capacity for noesis operating in us simultaneously, and that the basal temptation is to let ourselves fall into one or the other and let it dominate, whereas what we actually have to do is strive to integrate them and use them where they're strongest, each on each different subject that we approach, which is hard. It's hard because each of them wants to repel the other and claim that it can explain everything. And so when we're talking about things as categories, we're being noetic, right? We're talking about, you know, nice clean lines between things and things being separated from each other into categories, which we can then exclude the middle. And the law of the excluded middle now allows us to talk about true or false and to do logical deduction. And the whole thing is very noetically satisfying and powerful and far-reaching, while, as Hegel says, being false. To abstract is to be an error, says Hegel. You know, noesis lures us into these broad generalizations because it feels so satisfying and powerful to be able to speak about vast swaths of history with one summation, right? Democracy, theocracy, physiocracy. And it's like, woo, this is so tidy and organized. We got to learn to suspect the noetic.
Hegel alert. Hegel alert.
Yes,
vast swaths of history, the Hegel alert.
Yes, the Hegel alert, right? Because he himself fell into the trap plenty of times.
That's right.
Even while he was criticizing it at other times. So what you're doing here, Phil, that's really important is that you're reminding us of the other half, the gnosic half, which is that these things are not, they may result in opposites that contradict each other, but they develop through the bud, the blossom, and the fruit, like Hegel says, that the nature of the dialectic is that it is an organism unfolding new order over time into new stages of development, and that the old is on the one hand decisively refuted by the new, which developed in opposition to it, while at the exact same time being a continuation of the old and a preservation and in some ways a more full realization of the old. And so there are ways in which what we see in the medieval epoch is a contradiction against the ancient world, while in other ways, at the exact same time, it is a fulfillment of the ancient world, a more complete realization of it. And this is what's so hard for the noetic mind to grasp, because the noetic mind want things to be either true or false. They're either equal or they're not equal. They can't be simultaneously in direct opposition and also directly succeeding each other. That doesn't fit into nice logical schemas. We categorize that as a contradiction and say it must be false. But of course, what we learn from gnosis is that the closer you get to reality, the more you discover that the attempt to represent the infinite cosmos within the finite mind results in paradox. Paradox is the natural language, the true language of nature, speaking to the finite mind. And if there aren't any paradoxes, you probably aren't seeing it in its full true potential. So thank you, Phil, for bringing that up. That's really important to talk about. But he's not starting out with the dialectics, right? In the first opening sentences under medieval, he's starting out with the noetic contrasts, just to help us see it. But then he's going to have to weave it back together to get the whole picture. So yes, he says the Greek gods have been immanent in nature, at one with its forces, including its powers to sway and intoxicate the psyches of men. The gods of the ancients had been themselves subject to the overpowering order of nature, like Sharon quoted. Christianity for the first time conceived a God obligated to be holy or transcendent over such natural flux. This definition of holy is so important to the transition between the ancient world and the medieval world. There's what the Hebrews considered to be holy back in their own epoch when they were first developing these ideas. And then the word holy changes meaning during these arguments with ancient philosophers. And it comes to mean that it is profane to be subject to nature, because nature is seen as the inferior realm. God is seen as the superior realm. Nature is seen as the inferior. And that's how you're winning in the arguments against these nature gods. You're saying their God's over profane, limited things, and our God is a God over holy things, which are superior to your limited things. So in order to do that, the nature of God's holiness shifts specifically to his transcendental nature, to his being set apart, setting himself apart. That purity and isolation becomes the nature of the holy. If you're not transcendent to the natural flux, then you're not holy in the medieval conception of what it means to be holy. And so that's why human beings who are so bound up with nature are not intrinsically holy, but we have the gift of grace, which gives us the flicker that has the potential to remember what it is to be holy and to long for it, to long for God and to long for salvation. This is the structure of the medieval theology, is this idea that we may be natural creatures, but God gave us this gift. And if we will just listen to that still small voice inside of us, it will lead us out of the profanity of our natural, existence and upwards towards the transcendental holiness of God. This is what they're offering, at the junction point of the revolution between the ancient and the medieval. Stephen, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute.
Yes. Sorry, I just lost it.
Okay, that's all right. Just it'll come back to you. James, hey, how are you doing?
Hey, how are you? I appreciate this. So you're saying that the point where the pre-Socratics ended and the beginning of the Platonic Socratic era, right? That was a beginning when this idea of a transcendent being came into prominence, and with Plato's forms and so forth. And then Christianity kind of took over that idea and applied it to God as a transcendent being.
So let me say it a little differently. What I would say is that the Hebrews were they were not privileged within the ancient epoch. They were marginalized. They were on the outskirts. They were not originally part of the Hellenic worldview in any way. And they brought a different strand forward. And at first, that strand was seriously out of step with the world around them. The world around them rejected them and said, there's nothing about what you're saying makes sense, because we know that the universe is naturalistic and that the gods are naturalistic and everything is bound by these laws and so forth. And therefore they rejected what the Hebrews were offering. But at the same time that was happening, there was a strand within the Greek tradition that broke away from naturalistic polytheism and started critiquing the nature. Hey, how you doing, Joseph? That started critiquing the nature of the divine. And you see this before Plato in Parmenides, not in Parmenides' first philosophy, but in his second philosophy, where he starts to argue that that for there to be such a thing as existence, change must be impossible. Change must be an illusion. There must not actually be any change, and that that there must be two realities: a sort of fake flickering reality that looks like it's full of change but is actually full of contradictions, which Zeno attempted to prove Oh, you think you can walk places? Let me show you all the contradictions. You can't even take a single step, says Zeno. And he's trying to prove that what we take for reality is impossible. And that since logic only makes sense outside of our experience of life, and in this sort of abstract realm that he defines, he says, therefore, the abstract realm must be the real one, and what we take for reality must be false. This is the core of Parmenides' core philosophy, which can be summed up in 2 words, which are so concentrated that it is extremely irritating, hard to wrap your head around. Being is. Parmenides was so proud that he could boil his entire philosophy down into 2 words, being is, by which he meant absolute, unchanging existence is a real thing. And if you take that as a premise, all the rest of what Plato talks about in his own world of ideal forms is just a consequence of trying to demonstrate that absolute existence could be possible. If absolute existence is possible, then it's the real reality, and what we take for reality is the false reality. So you've got this strand running from Parmenides through Zeno and his other followers, and then into Plato. And at the same time, separately from that, you've got these strands rising up among the Hebrews, who are attempting to, with their monotheism and their arguments with the various breakaway sects within themselves, that they're developing a notion of monotheism. And it's really under the Roman Empire that you start to get these crossover sects that bring the ideas together. And when they come together, when the Christians are looking for a philosophical framework for their theology, and they're having all these arguments with Greeks and Romans and sort of Alexandrian Hellenistic civilization, they find that they get further if they appeal to Plato and Parmenides, because Plato and Parmenides are already familiar to all of the ancients. And so as soon as the Christians hit on that, they start to enjoy a lot of success. All the Neoplatonists start to come over, right? And that's the way in which the 2 lines meld into one, and Neoplatonism ends up becoming the backbone of medieval Christianity. Before that point, there were a lot of other versions of Christianity competing with what became the Orthodox canonical Christianity, and they were based on entirely different premises. There was a Heraclitean strand of Christianity that had a God who was more naturalistic and in which change was real, and flux, you can't step in the same river twice, was part of the theology of those Christians. But they didn't win out against the Orthodox canonizers. And so we got stuck with the Platonic and Neoplatonic schools.
Basically, though, philosophically, didn't Heraclitus say something like, yes, there is a world of flux, but you also cannot deny there is a being, a wholeness, right? Which he calls, what do you call it? Kenosis or yeah.
The logos.
The logos, yeah, right. So, and this is what someone like Heidegger has been trying to prove, right?
Right.
In spite of all the appearances and changes and the flux and so forth of existence, in this existential sense, that you could say he's an existentialist, but he's also arguing that there is this being that you have to see through these appearances and the changes, right?
Yeah, the thing that Heraclitus did that Plato and Parmenides couldn't quite understand is the idea that you don't have to follow the law of the excluded middle. That that stasis and dynamism, that existence and change don't have to be opposites. That it could be that you exist because you change. That the changes happening within you are what make your life possible. Like, we often go back to Sharon with her background in medicine and say, if it weren't for your body's capacity to generate insulin, right, your blood sugar would spike too high and you would die. But likewise, your body can produce glucagon, right? So when your blood sugar is too low, it can raise it back up again by drawing on the stores in the cells. And that it is what Heraclitus says is it's the tension, the dynamic tension and struggle between these things. It's not some kind of static isness that is the nature of existence. It's a dynamic but intertwined struggle of forces that creates the safe zone within which existence is possible.
Right.
And so he had this profound understanding in which these 2 things that Plato and Parmenides thought were opposites turn out not only not to be opposites in a literal, flat, contradictory sense, but turn out to be necessary to each other. Each makes the other possible.
Right.
So yeah,
As, right.
existence
So as organic beings, we can't be without becoming at the same time. Right?
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and that was too subtle for a lot of people who came later. They embraced the law of the excluded middle. They couldn't reconcile Heraclitus with the law of the excluded middle, and they decided he must be saying either one thing or the other thing, or at any rate he's confusing, and let's go look at Plato instead. Right? There was this great turning away. They called him Heraclitus the obscure. They said, we don't understand what he's talking about. It doesn't make sense to us. So thank you, James. Stephen and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, so words of a philosopher which intrigued me. I read it about 40 years ago and I can't remember exactly who it concerned anymore, but he said something very interesting which has always captivated me. And that is, he said, this is, of course, going back to a time when Western civilization was looking very triumphant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it seemed to have created miraculous powers of material wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And his worry, this philosopher, I think he was French, this philosopher's worry was that the Oriental world is looking at that materialism, that material technology, and thinks it's, oh, that's very nice. We want to acquire that for ourselves. But he said they're failing to take note of the Western spirit or philosophy which it grew out of, and that technology grew out of in the first place. So they're going to take the machine without understanding 1,000 or 2,000 or more history of Western history, which led to that. And the philosopher said, when that happens and as it grows, it will be tragic. It will be tragic for world culture, not to understand the spirit that developed that technology.
And the great irony, which I know you know and are thinking, even as you're saying this, is that we were obsessed with them screwing up by taking the material and ignoring the philosophical. But what actually happened is, it is we ourselves who abandoned an interest in our own philosophy and have become increasingly anti-philosophical in our sort of ultra-modern forms, which is exactly the barbarism that we were accusing the Orient of. It was what was latent in us all along and finally came into full blossom in the 20th and especially late 20th centuries. There is this way in which, you know, because power corrupts, or as Nietzsche puts it, I think more memorably and more insultingly at the same time, in it's because it's the same thing. Power makes stupid, right? The more you can solve your problems with brute power, the less you think about things. It discourages introspection and understanding. And so the irony is that although it took a great deal of philosophical insight to generate the beginning of all these powers, as the powers grew, it created a perverse incentive to stop engaging in philosophy and philosophy departments. One of Kenneth Smith picks up on Nietzsche in going after academia and saying what academia was supposed to become, it has not become. It's instead become sort of an internal culture obsessed with, you know, the games between different departments and who has tenure and who doesn't, publish or perish, do you have enough students? It's become just a little competitive, self-destructive ecosystem that turns away from doing bold work because nobody can take the risk. You have to be focused on what it takes to get and keep tenure. And as a result, you stop questioning the things that need to be questioned to be genuinely philosophical. And Nietzsche, of course, has a great sequence. It's some of my favorite of his writings, where he goes after his favorite philosophers and shows how each one of them, the thing that they most screwed up was the thing that was at stake for them in their own academic career. And so therefore they couldn't question it. And of course, Nietzsche being Nietzsche, he then proceeds to pat himself on the head for, you know, having abandoned his academic career because it means that he no longer has those ties on himself. And it's true. He was able to question things he would never have been able to question if he'd had to stay at the university and protect his career. So part of what Nietzsche and Smith are going after is even philosophers can be subverted by perverse incentives if they're caught up within this whole rewards and punishment system. And so it's not surprising that therefore outside of philosophy departments, the society as a whole is also constantly being pulled by, can I pay my rent? Can I pay my other bills? Am I going to make it? They drop philosophy by the wayside and they focus on the expedient, powerful solution, which as Nietzsche warns us leads to a blindness and a stupidity.
Was
I
Nietzsche,
can't remember.
was
Go ahead,
Nietzsche
Jim.
implying that Heidegger was either an example or just the opposite? That
Well, you know, one of the
exception, yeah.
one of the
Example or
fun
exception.
games,
Yeah.
one of the fun games to play in philosophy and the Kenneth Smithian approach is, can you understand a philosopher well enough that you can role play accurately what he would have said about something? And so the question is, can we role play Nietzsche well enough to say what he would have said about Heidegger if he could have looked back on Heidegger's career? And, you know, I don't understand Nietzsche that well, but Kenneth Smith does. And if we could ever lure him onto one of these seminars, we could actually ask him to role play for us. What would Nietzsche have to say about Heidegger? And I'm sure it would be highly entertaining because that's what he used to do in his classes.
Because
Hitchhiker's-
like Heidegger became a rector, right, by replacing his former teacher.
Right.
Was that it? Who was that Herschel? I think it was
Can't
Herschel, was it?
remember. It might be.
Yeah, he became the rector for a whole year by replacing his friend and teacher. I think
It was Husserl.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about that bit in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy when the two philosophers come in for a demarcation dispute.
Uh-huh.
Will we arrive at a situation where discussing philosophy will require a license? Because the powers that be will decide that they own philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
You're not allowed to indulge in it without their license. Will we arrive at that situation?
I think that is a potent question. We'll have to keep our eyes out. Phil and then Donald. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I want to return to how important St. Augustine was.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, the Roman Empire in the late BCs and into the early ADs were dealing with a lot of struggle, and particularly in Jerusalem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those
Mm-hmm.
Jews were it almost seemed like the troublemakers were the thing that initiated something. And it was, in some sense, the early Christians, and I would say, I would guess it was St. Paul, who says, no, we're not Jews, we're not like them at all. We're willing to compromise, we're peaceful people.
Mm-hmm.
And what that allowed was, in a sense, allow for the synthesis between Athens and Jerusalem. And that's what happened when Augustine was able to unite the Jewish God with Parmenides and Plato,
Mm-hmm.
singularity, right? And so, in
Mhm.
some sense, but it was a synthesis in a traditional way, rather than what Hegel would say, a layering,
Mm-hmm.
because they had to deny the Jews in order to, in a sense, create this synthesis
Right.
that was in Jerusalem with Athens to produce Rome, in a way. So in some sense, I think the fact that he found that synthesis, not what Hegel called a true synthesis, but which would be a layering, which is the not forget the Jews,
Right.
but to reject it. I think that was an important tactical move, because he knew both cultures, you know, the
Right.
Gentiles and the Hebrews, and yet he found a way to sublimate the Hebrews, and nonetheless brought around Jerusalem into Athens to create the new religion of Christianity. because as you said before that, there was much more diversity. I would say layering, possibility of layering that didn't happen. So the purity of Plato's forms to God's mind was, in some sense, quite simple and easy to do once you made that sort of synthesis and rejected the Jews. And of course, we rejected the Jews forever. And we're still doing it now. But nonetheless, yeah, exactly. They were the third element that was like on the out. Right. And so nonetheless, they took these central aspects of that and turned it into the Christian church.
Yes.
So which became later on, the core of the late Roman Empire, and then on.
And this is what's interesting about this is that, there's the level at which when we talk about these things, it's a little abstracted, and, we evaluate based on whether we find it compelling, whether we're convinced and so on. But for the people embracing Plato at the time, he was solving very serious existential problems for them. The early Christians at that period were in serious danger. And there were, if they didn't solve those problems, they might cease to exist. They had to find a solution, which is why when they found the theological framework by which Plato seemed to solve all those existential problems for them, they just bound him to their side with hoops of steel, right? I mean, he became, they didn't just allow Plato in, they seized Plato. They had to have him, and they built him right into the center. I mean, Augustine had to write City of God. He had to, in order to heal various rifts. And
Plato was a saint,
right?
Was actually a saint,
effectively a saint. And Aristotle, in his, shall we say, shackled form, where he's the king of logic and not the king of naturalism. They didn't really want to talk about that part. They wanted to talk about the logic, because that married well with Plato. All the parts where Aristotle was criticizing Plato, often about the very things that the Christians embraced at that period, they didn't really want to talk about that part of Aristotle at all. They wanted to harmonize them so that Aristotle could become the logical framework to justify the two. So yeah, we know that we're starting to get a grasp on these perspectives when we reach the point where we can understand why they really didn't have a choice. They had to make the choice they did because we understand the gravity of the problems that they were facing, why they needed this. And at a step back, at just the general step, certainly we can empathize with the idea that Rome had become so corrupt that it was intolerable. There had to be a new worldview. There had to be. They'd ridden that horse as far as it was go, and the horse was now eating them. They couldn't have the horse be eating them anymore. They had to get off this damn horse and do something else. So Donald, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I got my hand up. It's like David is shut my video off, though.
You could turn it on.
No, I can't. It says the host has stopped it. I had to leave for a bit. I think so. But
I miss seeing you, Donald.
There you are.
There we go. I'm back now. Okay. Have we made it to the second paragraph of medieval yet?
Not a chance, but go ahead.
Not a chance. No, okay, then I'll talk about Plato. No, I won't talk about.
Yeah.
Looking back, Plato's a lot more Christian than he was looking forward.
That's
I just
right.
want that to be clear.
I
And
agree
while he
100%.
talks about ideas, there aren't any ideas that can't be reified in Plato.
Right.
You either point to concrete instances, so they are the ideas of this world, this nature, whatever. They are not otherworldly. They are not Christian.
It's Augustine that did that.
Yes. And for all the love of Plato, it's still in the New Testament. no one comes to the Father except through the Son.
Right.
Plato, Aristotle never knew the Son, never had a chance. Einstein showed us that nice relativity cone of experience picture, you know, and they're outside it. They could never have known. So
he came later.
He came. So I don't. If you want to think this, if you want to blame this all on Plato, fine, have at it. I don't think it's as strong an argument, or it adds anything to understanding the ancients or the medievals. But where I will say something else.
Yeah, shoot.
More about paragraph 2, not a
all
chance.
Right, let's look at
It's very,
2.
but we've talked, Phil keeps referring to it, that it's really nice and convenient that while the Judaism was, these were an ancient people living in the ancient millennium, had the right kind of God for medievalism. He may have just had, he got a scope change. He was just had this covenant with his people, but he was still a creator ex nihilo. You know, he still had different powers from the sky gods of all those people that lived around the Jews.
Right.
And that's an important thing, that Yahweh, our God, whatever, was a different type of God. Even in antiquity, different type of God. And the other thing is that nature, ancient nature, could not give rise to a medieval man, only to
keep going,
because he would have given rise to that. Nature gives rise, and I think this is one of Kenneth's big points here. He gives rise to a man more like the ancients saw, a man with soul but not spirit.
Right. Immersed in the world.
Immersed in the world. And that's pretty clear that when we move forward, antiquity to the medieval millennia, that nature, we've got these reordering, but we've also got a re-understanding. We've got God, man, nature, these 3 terms.
Yes.
But it's not only are they now in a different order, what we mean by man and what we mean by God and what we mean by nature are different. They haven't just done rock, hammer, scissors, and a different guy won.
That's right.
It's
redefined everything.
It's redefined.
That's right.
It's so I guess I've said enough. Leave Plato alone. Leave Plato out of this.
I know you love Plato. I know.
Well, I love the stories.
Yeah, his stories are great.
And the imagery.
Yes.
And
he's a great poet. He's a great poet.
He's a great dramatist. And and you had Plato writing of Socrates, the sort of paternal figure guiding the youth of Athens.
Right.
And you had another great poet, not a dramatist, but a comic poet, Aristophanes.
Yes.
With equal skill. Great stories.
Yes.
You know, we'll say what? These disrespecting him.
Let's explore what you said, because this is important, that Plato is more than what the medievals tried to make him into, right? It is the case that whenever a real human being is taken up by a later movement and made into one of their saints, to use the language that you use, they distort them. they finitize them, they warp them into what they need them to be instead of who they actually are. I alluded to the fact that they did that to Aristotle, but you're absolutely right, they did it to Plato too. That Plato in his own rights is far more interesting than the Plato of Augustine and the rest of the medieval world. And one of the ways that we can describe that is that if it weren't for Plato, we would have a lot less Heraclitus. Because before Plato seized on Parmenides, he spent a lot of time in the work of Heraclitus. And he described an enormous amount of Heraclitean philosophy. The Heraclitean philosophy is closer to the mainstream of ancient Greek philosophy before the classical era than the Parmenidean, than the ideal forms are. But the problem was that Heraclitus wrote in a cryptic mode, in a condensed, trying to create these aphorisms mode. And so it was hard for people to see what was all packed in there. Part of what's wonderful about Plato's exegesis of Heraclitus is that he unpacks those things into dialogues and stories and pictures and images that are unforgettable and that really add to our ability to comprehend Heraclitus.
I think to some extent, Plato is really trying to solve the problems presented by Heraclean philosophy that I don't find a fragment where Heraclitus, but identity through change. Everything is change. But where do we come from?
Right.
Is it in memory? How is memory possible?
Right.
How is there a multitude of seemingly similar things?
Right.
These are problems. Heraclitus is right. Everything is change. I think that. And you either take the Parmenidean and say, change is illusory. There's nothing to see here, other than delusion. Or you work at these things in the way I think Plato and Aristotle did.
That's right.
About how are things organic in nature with a constant changing process.
Yes.
But what's the process? What's the unity? And Phil should know this because he never says he at Penn State listened to Stanley Rosen, but Stanley Rosen visited LSU and it was identity and change was his lecture topic. And it was right out of this discussion.
Right.
I never thought at the time that it would be useful, but
behold,
I think it is a problem. It's a problem we still just tend to overlook,
right? Because
we're so clearly ourselves. We so clearly endure through time that we never ask. Not only do we not ask how we can do it, but how can every other thing do it too?
Right. Right.
And that's all of nature. How does this work for all of nature?
That's right.
I'm going to be quiet.
No, but it's great. It's great what you brought up. And one way to think about it, there's a couple of issues around here. And part of why this is so important is because Plato was such an iconic figure for the rise of medieval Christianity. And so it's hard for us, when we talk about the Kenneth Smith goal of getting us out of the habit of looking at other philosophers from our point of view and learning to look at them from their point of view, that the real value comes when we adopt that distance from our own perspective so that we can triangulate on the world. Part of what that implies, which goes right with what Donald is saying, is that it is inadequate for us to accept the medieval conception of Plato, because that's a medieval conception of Plato. That's not Plato's own perspective. And if we really want to be able to play this game mentally, to be able to see more of the world by adopting more perspectives, then we have to be able to recognize and admit to the medieval perspective of Plato, but then set it on a shelf and dig deeper into Plato himself and find out, well, who is he when he's not being warped to serve this function in the medieval theology and philosophy? Who's Plato in his own right? And there's a number of things that come out of that. And one is due to the cultural genocide of the medieval era, the extent to which they destroyed everything that they could destroy that contradicted their orthodoxy, if they hadn't preserved Plato, if they hadn't had their fetish for Plato, regardless of whether Plato would have approved of it or not, thanks to their fetish, Plato has preserved for us an enormous amount of philosophy we would have lost. It would just be gone. There are many things that are attested to only in Plato, or that are attested to in Plato in ways such that the other attestations we have, which are more brief or cryptic, come into proper focus because we've got Plato writing about them at more length so that we can now understand what those other references are. He's a major optic. He's a major perspective into what would have otherwise been a lost world. And so we're forever in Plato's debt. The other thing, of course, is that in some ways, like Nietzsche, and Nietzsche must be spinning in his grave that I'm about to say this, Plato was less concerned with laying down an orthodoxy and more concerned with philosophical exploration itself. And if that meant that in his earlier works he said things that later he contradicted, then like Nietzsche, he was fine with that because it was the journey that mattered. If he spent some time with Heraclitus and he spent some time with Parmenides and he spent some time with Socrates and others, and in different dialogues, brought different ones into focus, he didn't mind. He didn't go back and erase the past positions and say, well, that's not my philosophy anymore. I need to get rid of it and suppress it. He was fine having the contradictions exist in his own work, which allows us to see a fuller scope than we would have been able to see if he'd been a different personality. So we owe an enormous debt to Plato, and we can't, as with what the Nazis did to Nietzsche, we can't blame Plato for what the medievals did to Plato. That's, you set things out into the world and then you don't have control over them anymore. And they have their own, as Heraclitus says, they become little dooms of their own, separate from your own doom. Their fate is now out of your hands. So I'm with you, Donald, about not vilifying Plato. And I often talk about him in ways that overly shorthand that, for which I apologize. Before I call on James, I guess I'd like to add that one of the interesting ways to help overcome the medieval distortions on Plato is to read Ernst Cassirer, the 20th century Neoplatonist. Because Ernst Cassirer sought to, in his eyes, correct Plato by relocating the world of ideal forms out of the external cosmos and into the mind. Mm-hmm. He says that what Plato's describing in the realm of eternal forms he's not agreeing with Parmenides and saying that's how the world is. He's saying that what Plato's actually saying is that's how we understand the world, is through the forms in our minds that we then compare everything that's specific to. That's how our process of categorization works. And I don't know whether anywhere in that 3-volume kind of magnum opus that Cassirer wrote, whether he says that Plato meant it that way, or whether he says that it was there latent in Plato all along waiting to be unpacked. But either way, it gives us a way to break free of the sort of stereotypical readings we have of Plato and start to think that, maybe Plato's fresher than we think he is. And there's more going on in Plato than we're inclined to read in him. I see you came off mute, Donald. Do you want to add something?
Well, we still don't know where numbers reside.
For example,
I mean,
the number 2.
Yeah, where is the number 2?
Where is the number 2? If I hold up 2 apples, I definitely do not have the number 2 because they're not exactly the same, are they?
We just, it's typically modern that we're able to just overlook
the most fundamental questions.
So many problems that Plato, and it's not just Plato, Aristotle takes these things up again with different answers, with critiques of his predecessors.
Right.
That's fine. I'm not arguing that Kenneth doesn't accurately portray a medieval or even modern view of Plato, that he is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance was a hugely popular book when I was in school. And it's clear. Trace Western civilization back to its origin in Plato, and there you find all the source of all its problems. Karl Popper, trace it back, Plato. It's where all the problems started. And I'm not arguing that they're not right as moderns, or the medievals weren't right as medievals. But that's, if we just take that stance, I think, then we're missing an opportunity.
That's right.
And I'll be quiet.
Okay, I'm going to call on James in just a sec, but I'm going to add one more thing to underscore what you just said. And that's that what the medievals did to Aristotle, in addition to overemphasizing his logic, his law of the excluded middle, is they also overemphasized the answers that he gave to various questions about astronomy, biology, politics, and so on. And they underemphasized the processes of exploration that he was trying to illustrate with the answers that he gave. Aristotle was not trying to lay down an orthodoxy that would rule the Western mind for 1,000 years. What he was trying to do is demonstrate what kind of answers you get when you approach subjects from the perspective of naturalistic philosophy instead of from the perspective of, ironically, dogma. And the fact that the medievals could turn that inside out and turn him into received dogma about how biology works, how physics works, how astronomy works, you just know Aristotle spun in his grave for the next 1,500 years at what they did with his work. And part of what it illustrates is that there is nothing that you can say or write that is so perfectly itself that other people can't come along later and turn it completely inside out and make you the champion of the things that you abhorred. Just like Nietzsche would have despised all the anti-Semites who held up Nietzsche as a champion of anti-Semite values, right? He would have, if there is an afterlife, Nietzsche suffered unbelievably through the whole Nazi era and to the current day with all the neo-Nazis who say, yeah, Nietzsche hated the Jews. And here's Nietzsche in his own words praising the Jews and wishing that we would be more like them. And he's like, how could you turn me into that? Of all the things to turn me into, why would it be that? And the answer is, there is nothing we can say that can't be turned inside out. If it could happen to Nietzsche, if it could happen to Aristotle, it certainly happened to Plato. And it's not fair. It's not fair to hold Plato to account for the next 2,500 years of ills when he wasn't around to correct his own mistakes, which he would certainly have done in the light of new information. And instead to freeze him at a point in his development and claim that he's now responsible for everything that he got wrong at that moment in time. It's like kicking a child. It's just mean because it means that we're not paying attention to the gifts and we're only paying attention to the inevitable truth that to err is human. James, and then Phil, and then Stephen. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, was Ernst Cassirer a Kantian? And he was interpreting Plato from that point of view?
Yeah, he's a neo-Kantian, but he's definitely correcting Kant and using those corrections to change the interpretation of Plato.
Right. So also I want to ask you about Kierkegaard, and I noticed that Kenneth Smith includes Kierkegaard in his philosophical understanding of what's going on. So how do you understand Kierkegaard on this issue, this problem, philosophical problem of change and being?
I can't do justice to that. I can't do justice to that.
Because I'm talking about a particular book he wrote called Repetition. Now, does he mean repetition by that, a repetition of the forms or the repetition of being, or does he mean repetition as a repetition of change or part of becoming? Or
you've hit one of my weak spots. I haven't read Repetition.
Oh, you haven't? Oh, okay.
No.
Trying to grapple with that one.
Yeah, I look forward to reading it, and maybe in one of these future ones we could have a conversation about that. I know that Kierkegaard's Kierkegaard's position in the development of this existentialist line of philosophy that leads through Kenneth Smith is particularly interesting because on the one hand, he is a neo-Hegelian. He is concerned with the dialectic. He is concerned with the structure of the mind and the structure of history. He embraces those things, but he extends especially the exploration of the development of personality out of character and out of the structure of the mind far further than Hegel did. And he takes a note from Plato by writing it in a literary form instead of in a literal form. That is to say, he often doesn't say what he means, and instead what he'll do is portray dialogues between characters who exemplify different perspectives. And if some of them seem absurd or ridiculous, that's how he refutes those positions. But it means that if you just literally quote some part of Kierkegaard, you could be quoting the very thing that he's refuting by making it seem ridiculous, but out of context, it sounds like Kierkegaard's in favor of it. And it makes Kierkegaard a tough read because you really have to understand his whole body of work to take each fragment of it in proper context. My problem is I'm still working my way through Kierkegaard. And so I would be inclined, if I pick up any random piece of Kierkegaard, to misinterpret it just because I don't have the full picture yet. So,
Okay. All right, thanks.
and I know that he's an important enough philosopher and he writes deeply enough and thinks deeply enough about these things that he deserves, that especially with a work I haven't read, he deserves better than what I could give him. So I have to decline to try to help there. There are others who are far better qualified than I am. It's a great question though. Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, look, I first I must begin by saying I love Plato. He still remains paramount in my ideas. Okay.
You just made Donald happy. Look at his face.
No, but
Really look.
But there is a resentment I do have of him when he sort of pigeonholed the dramatist and the artist, right?
Yes. In the
and
Republic.
really put them down because I value Sophocles equally as much,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so there was a time in, I think, during the Roman period, forgot what period, and then also in the late 17th and early 18th century when closet drama was very popular, which means it was written but never performed and never intended to be performed. It was a kind of literature.
I didn't know about this movement.
What's a structure in a kind of like just the repetition of words in the mind.
Yeah.
So I think the problem is I always thought of the arts, whether that's drama or painting, or music, as maybe, and even literature, is something that mediates between the ideas and the world, that actually manifests itself in sort of some kind of sensuous form rather than ideas.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is a problem. And the fact that Plato wrote his dialogues in the form of poetry, which he, quote, despises because it's such a lower form. I mean, that is a resentment and a contradiction that is problematic for me, even though I love him, as a thinker. And I think it might be that same problem that actually extended into the medieval, into the modern times, right? Because such an emphasis on the mind and ideas are categorized in words, but not through, in a sense, a manifestation in the world, then I think becomes a problem. And so that is the criticism I have, despite the fact I love him dearly, probably as much as any philosopher. But I think we all have our flaws. And I think the later ages ignore that flaw a bit much and took the abstraction to an extreme. And I think that becomes a problem. I think Plato was only reaching to the forms. It was a ideal or aspiration, and then of course Augustine turned it into an actuality. And I think that's where it becomes a problem, because when you have an aspiration, it's always incomplete in its own way.
Yeah.
And so therefore it is a striving, not, you could maybe say it's a teleology, but it's a striving.
Yeah.
And that process is very important and it's unfolding. So please don't regard me as a Plato hater, because I still think of him probably as number one in my list. But we all have flaws, and I think the fact that he slammed poetry, it's almost unforgivable. In fact, it's lower than the world itself because it's supposedly a misrepresentation.
Yeah, I think it's useful to remember that these people aren't abstract teachers of, philosophical positions, but they're people.
Yeah.
And, each of them has their issues. And, it's easiest to see with Nietzsche, because Nietzsche is such a personality that you can hardly pick up a sentence of Nietzsche without feeling him all over it. And Walter Kaufmann's great translations of Nietzsche, and particularly his book entitled Nietzsche, are really fascinating, because Kaufmann obviously loves Nietzsche enough to want to rehabilitate him from what he had been portrayed as by the Nazis, and redid all the translations. You don't do that unless you have real passion behind the project. And he praises Nietzsche as a stylist, as well as, loving his courage and his willingness to grapple with really tough issues, even if it made him unpopular. And yet, Kaufmann will say Nietzsche has his problems, and a lot of them stem from early traumas. And one of his problems is that, man, he can't stop praising himself. It's like there's any number of beautiful passages of Nietzsche that are fantastic, philosophically and poetically, but you have to know to stop the quote right before he gets to the part where he pats himself on the head for it, because he's got this drive, and Kaufmann says, even when Nietzsche is right about his self-praise, even when he's right that no German philosopher before him was as willing to criticize, the things that he depends on for his livelihood as Nietzsche was. And even when that means it's true that he's willing to go further at exploring these fundamentals, there's something in us that revolts against it because of all the times he praised himself when he didn't have to. If he would have just been able to rein it in, we would have bought it more fully. And he says, so, the point is, you can love a philosopher so deeply and still recognize that there are issues. And I think with Plato, we have to acknowledge that the loss of Socrates was an enormous trauma to Plato, and it embittered him. And there are things that he wrote in the Republic that you can tell parts of that he wrote specifically out of anger. Was it Aristophanes who mocked Socrates in one of his plays? And then Socrates is executed. And you better believe Plato hated Aristophanes for having done that, because now his teacher is gone, but he's left with this immortal work mocking his teacher and portraying him as a caricature after his death. So, all of these guys, we have to read with caveats. They're people, right? It's like, I've brought it up before, I'm always struck by how does Hannah Arendt, who escaped the Holocaust and became one of its fiercest and most trenchant critics, have a love affair with Heidegger, who I think it goes too far to say he was a Nazi, but it's perfectly fair to say he allowed himself the company of the Nazis, perhaps in order to not get punished himself. I mean, who knows? He could have had various motivations, but whatever his reasoning, there are times when we would have liked to see Heidegger fight the Nazis, and instead there he is at their parties and they're praising him, and he's not responding by saying, you suck. We're like, you should have said you suck. And so how does Hannah Arendt, relate? There's these things, but at some point we come down to the level that they're human beings, and their own lives and their own traumas are gonna shape a certain percentage of what comes out of them. Stephen, and then Donald. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up that map I posted in the chat. Now, this is interesting. In the depths of the Dark Ages, this map really grabs me. But you look at the territory, which was held by Christendom, and it was hanging by a thread.
That's right.
Everyone thinks, yeah, Constantine, we're on the rise, we were up, we grabbed it. But then it almost was taken away.
Yeah, that's right.
Yet Christendom fought back and eventually became the power it was in the later Middle Ages. And I find that map shocking.
Yeah.
We don't get this picture from your historians.
And we should.
They don't tell us how Christendom was almost wiped out at one point.
That's
right.
Right.
You look at our territory, you've just got the Byzantines, you've got Italy, you've got the Franks.
Yeah.
You've got that the Anglo-Saxon Britain was the new acquisition, but they'd lost a hell of a lot.
They had, and they were going to lose more. You know, there's some things that that even strengthen your argument that you can't see from the map. Is how many of these territories Christianity was an urban phenomena among the upper classes, in a way that it wasn't in its origins. In its origins, it was a slave religion and a lower class religion. But by this point in history, it was being spread through political marriages. And, you know, a Christian woman would marry a pagan king and convert him over. And then they would get the court converted and then the nobles converted. But it might be many centuries before the villages and towns were converted because they remained very pagan, very heathen, as the theologians of the time complained endlessly. And fairly, there was an enormous resistance to Christianity. So there is this way in which the thread is even more threadbare than it looks from a map like this, because in these territories were mostly pagan, with a sprinkling of Christianity hanging on barely. And as we know, you know, Islam was going to hit hard up through Spain and almost cross the Pyrenees to take France. It was so close. And later, the most decisive thing was when the Mongols came through, conquered half of Europe, and would have conquered the rest if it weren't for that, you know, as the way my revered history teacher put it at the University of Washington, he was a Yale professor of history who was lecturing there. He said, the only reason that the Mongols didn't completely wipe out what we think of as Western civilization is that somebody died back home. There was going to be a state funeral. And the Mongols were like, why would we want to finish conquering this shithole when we can go home and enjoy the parties and splendor? So they all went back. And they almost came back to Europe and finished the job. And then they were like, do we really want to go traipsing around in the muck and dirt and, you know, mud and disease of Europe and finish it? Or should we just stay here? And they said, you know what? Let's just stay here. It's so much nicer. If Europe had been a cleaner, nicer place, it would have been wiped off the map by the Mongols. The only reason they didn't go back is it was just too awful. And we don't teach that in our history because it's not glorious. But the Mongols were just
so the Christian peasants covered themselves with shit, and that scared the flies away.
Right? I mean, you know, guns, germs, and disease. Guns, Germs, and Steel, you know, is a brilliant title of why Europe succeeded. And the germs are a major part of it. And along with the germs, we have to understand the unspoken filth, enormous amount of filth. If we weren't so dirty, the Mongols would have finished conquering us, and that would have been the end of that. But that was in the 1300s, 1400s, and they kind of took half of it.
Around about 1230, there was, something like that. Yeah.
I'm off by a couple
1240.
Centuries. Yeah. So
Subutai was the leader who went back, and later on he tried to come back and finish the job.
Too late. So yeah, it's like 737, which you've quoted there, is a great period for seeing how precarious it was. And there's several other periods that are like that, where it was just came within a hair of being wiped out. And you know, that translates itself into trauma, and it becomes cultural and civilizational trauma. An abused civilization becomes an abuser, just like an abused.
Not forgetting there are those who are in Trump's army.
Right.
Like me.
Well,
thank you for that, Stephen. Donald, go ahead. You've got your hand up.
Oh, there's some lovely filth over here.
Right. Yeah, now we're back to Monty Python.
I wanted to talk to Phil a little bit, because I think the subtitle of The Republic is sort of why we can't have nice things, or more like why we can't have just governments. Because as the argument goes on in the Republic, well, you have to eliminate the family.
Right.
There's, you know, there are mothers and fathers and children, but none of them know each other. You don't have, your guardians can't own anything. You know, we're worried about what people might read or where they get their ideas. So we have to get rid of drama and poetry and these things. Besides that, we can't find any decent leaders, because if we find them, they leave and we can't get them to come back. So this is a sort of I read the Republic more as a sort of, why are we not going to get just government ever?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because the preconditions for it simply cannot be had anywhere at any time. And so I look at it as, yes, it's utopian in the sense of it's no place and nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
You know, now as far as I know, I'm one of the few that reads Plato this way, that a lot of his arguments are kind of negative,
right,
because they really are. They represent things where we're just not going to do any better than what we're doing, or it's always going to be a compromise. So I don't think, I think if Plato, like, really, I mean, there's a reason in the logic of the Republic to throw the dramatist out and to throw the poets out, because you're eliminating all these things that getting in the way of the guardians or the people, the other classes there, doing the right thing, making the right decisions and stuff. Believe, you know, so you have this, well, not everybody's going to be able to understand the philosophical arguments. So some are going to have to understand mythological arguments,
right,
whatever. So you got to clean up your myth, because I think there are just a lot of things in the way the Republic is, and the way it's often read and commented on, that just aren't supported by the text. Just, if you take a much broader look at what's happening, you say, oh, we've gone to Lilliput or something here. and here are real reasons why it's going to be hard to establish a just government. And that reminded me of something, that my own comment. The Greeks had laws, lots of laws, you know, they were sort of majoritarian, they were democratic, majoritarian. If you account for just the citizens,
right,
the majority of these citizens made the rules. And there's a good book by Moses Finley on Greek law, where he says they keep trying to get these laws that say you can't change. They don't really have a constitution, but the laws for us would be like, and you can't change the constitution. We try to have laws against rebellion and stuff like that, and they just don't work. They get ostracism and stuff, but they didn't have like constitutional law where everybody agrees that forever this is the way things are going to be, right, because the majority can always just change it. The majority of the citizens can always just change it. And so majorities pass laws that you can't change any more laws, and then another majority comes along and changes them. And I think in that context, it kind of Plato makes sense as far as showing a little bit about how difficult it is to come up with a just system of government. I think it does provide us some kind of measure that we can apply to a government and say, where is it having its problems? What's the nature of the injustice that this government is providing? And that can be helpful, but maybe that'll console Phil about the poets. I think if Plato had really, if Plato had really hated the poets, I think in the Apology, Socrates talks about Aristophanes, and I think he almost finds Aristophanes funny.
Right.
He's not mad at Aristophanes for betraying him that way in the clouds. Hey, it was a good joke.
Right.
But it was a joke. It's not reasons for killing me.
Right.
Oh, I'm dying laughing.
So let me check, Donald, before I call on Stephen. This is the first time I've heard this argument about the Republic, and I got to say I really like it. That you're saying that the Republic is not a prescription. You're saying it's an argument ad absurdo, ad reductio, to demonstrate the impossibility of achieving a perfect society, because all the steps you'd have to take would lead to this absurd, condition.
I agree with that. I mean, it's my interpretation. It got me into graduate school at one time offering this, but I never wrote that dissertation on a new way to read Plato. And it looks now like I'm just going to take it with me to the grave so somebody else gets to rediscover it in the next generation.
Well, now I have to reread the Republic with what you just said in mind.
Yeah.
Because that's brilliant. That's a completely different take on it. I wish you would write that down, Donald. That's fabulous. I would buy that book.
I wish I would too, but I don't think I'm going to. But I think I think I can make a strong case that way.
Yeah.
That the conditions ultimately become so onerous that it must be obvious that something else is going on.
Right.
Well, it's an indication of the many things you could do with the donkey in Aesop's fable. That was I take that as a picture of the Greek styles of government where they had democracy and everybody was saying, no, do this, no, do that. Oh, try that. And some of the ideas are really absurd. And in the end, they lose the donkey. And to me, that was an obvious criticism of Grecian politics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, go ahead, Stephen. You had your hand up, and then Phil, and then we'll go back to
yeah, I was just going to make a point. At the beginning of this whole era, just before the rise of the Greeks, we had 1,500 years of the Aryans, the Indo-Europeans. They devised the chariot, the lightweight chariot wheel and the lightweight chariot as a weapon of war, and they used this to tremendous advantage.
Yeah.
They conquered India, they conquered Iran. We're not sure of their exact movement into Europe, but this was used powerfully in Europe, and their language became the dominant languages of those regions.
And they conquered Greece.
People also forget the attempted invasion of the Middle East went on for a long time. The Middle Eastern cultures eventually came back, acquired the technology, and they retained their own languages. But essentially, we're talking about this man, this culture that appeared before the rise of the Greeks, and in part was the reason the Greeks existed.
Right.
And the Indians existed. I mean, if we take Beowulf and the Bhagavad Gita, we see the same tendencies. Arjuna's facing the same questions that the hero Beowulf faces in his story. But this is a question, essentially, what was the Aryan?
Right.
And he was a creature very popular even in your own American tradition. What was he essentially? He's a poetic figure. He's even in your songs, he's in your movies.
Mm-hmm.
Who was that man? And It's so painfully and characteristically obvious. Nobody gets it. Anybody answer what was essentially that Indo-European culture? What was that Aryan culture? Who was he? Can any of you dig that out? It took me a long time to work it out.
Well, go ahead, tell us.
A cowboy.
The
The Aryans domesticated the horse, and what did they have?
Yeah.
A weapon they could use to a degree that these other, even more sophisticated cultures could not deal with for a long time.
Right.
Here comes the cowboy.
Right.
And he's still ringing in our ears in all our movies today. You know, it's like a Bon Jovi song, I'm a cowboy. I ride a
that's a
steel
good
horse.
point.
He's still with us.
You're right. You know, with that analysis, you could say the same thing about the Vikings. Why were the Vikings so successful? You know, it was the boat was the chariot of the waters, and it allowed them to go everywhere.
Yeah, the mobility. But even the Vikings, you look at their legends, the prose edda points back to the ancient ancestors on the Russian steppes.
That's right.
They were still echoing that in some godforsaken place in Europe.
Right.
A couple of thousand years later, we worship the horse to remind us of the ancient ancestors, which they delineated as people living in the Ukraine. Yeah, I understand your bit with the ship, that the Vikings use that mobility as the horsemen use the mobility. But this is a thing, the cowboy. There's a man standing on his feet, and then there was a man riding the horse, and this created a disposition that was so different.
That's really interesting, Stephen. I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. Thank you. That's really interesting.
Stephen, do you also believe that everything can be reinterpreted based on Shane?
I repeat that. I have an unstable connection.
You do? Shane, it's a very famous cowboy movie.
Oh, the film.
The film. It's got
Yeah.
It's got Shane, the farmers and the ranchers. And some people say
rewatched it a couple of years later. The war
all of human history, every event just needs to be mapped properly onto Shane, and you know how it's going to do. Since everything is
a war between the farmer and the cattle herder.
That's interesting. Phil, go ahead, and then I'll take us back to the text.
Yeah, no, what Stephen said was interesting and powerful, but I disagree with it nonetheless. But I'm going to go on to my point about asking Donald, like, yes, if this state was an irony that could not be formed, then you could find a compromise or to a certain degree, the answer in China, right? In other words, Confucianism was to form a stable society, not an ideal society, a stable society in which you could create a harmony between the ruler and the people. First of all, that took a long time for Confucianism to establish itself. And second of all, what it did was it became an instrument of pacification of the people in terms of their own identity. I mean, to filial piety, you know, and those of you that have any experience in that culture knows that, you know, the sons, let alone the daughters, were oppressed by this system, right? And maybe you would say they were happily oppressed, but I think that they weren't. And so, you know, so that was contested. And also, you know, like when Mao came along, he was able to turn the sons against their father by his little red book. So even that, it wasn't quite stable. So the power structure could overcome that. The little red book, you know, turned Confucianism, filial piety into nothing. They become the enemy. The fathers became the enemy. So did the teachers, on all the structures of society. So it was also vulnerable. And now, of course, many people think that that was a lost generation because of that upheaval. So I don't know. I mean, it's like, yeah, you could have a compromise for stability rather than sort of some sort of how should I say, justice, and which you accept a certain amount of oppression to, in a sense, create stability. Because maybe Confucius recognized the imperfection of human beings, and that you have to have some kind of compromise in between, right? So following the Tao was not the way, but it was, in terms of the way of civilization, you have to just allow a certain amount of oppression as long as it's not too far. And I think that would be the solution. And I don't know whether neo-Confucianism Confucianism is being revived in China, or whether the state will continue to be a singular rules. I don't know. So that's your answer to the irony, right? Because I don't think Confucius was trying to be ironic. He was trying to, solve a social problem with the compromise. So I don't know. I'm questioning all of that. All of that seems to lead to a degree of ambiguity. So did the cowboys. I mean, the cowboys had to exist in one sense for manifest destiny to take place, because there were other people that stood in the way, and only that degree of self-assertion was going to make the clearing, because those Eastern liberals, they were a little bit critical by saying, no, you've gone a little too far, right? And maybe just putting them in reservations would be good enough. So I don't know. I don't know whether suppression of diversity is the answer, or whether too much diversity is the answer, because that also creates, in some sense, in a way, the warring states, which we are now in. So I have no idea. So I'm a little confused. I tend to be supportive of multiple voices in my own way, not to shut them out, but nonetheless, remember in Charlottesville's day, the Jews will not replace us. That's been something that's been in the culture for a very, very long time.
2,000 years.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Thank you, Phil. So we've got another half hour yet, so I'm gonna open up another little box here in this next sentence of the first paragraph on the medieval section, which is just another can of worms about the differences between the ancient worldview and the medieval worldview. We probably won't finish this week, but I mean the implications of this one sentence, but we might. He says, not obscure fate, to which Zeus and the Olympians had to defer as a higher power, but the rational and moral will of a benevolent divinity was now the ultimate source of order, the ruling arche that accounted for the way the world is. That sentence is just, there is so much there. Arche are the principles.
Is that page 5?
That's the very first paragraph on the section on medieval within the introduction. It's near the top of the next page in that same paragraph.
Sorry, is that the number 5? So the pages are in order. I don't have a PDF. I just go by what's on the net.
Yeah, my page numbering is different from yours, so I can't say. Let me see if I can count pages and see if it adds up to 5. That's 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, it might be page 5.
Yeah, could you repeat that headline again? Sorry.
So the headline is medieval, Oh no, that's not in his, that's in mine. It's the paragraph that begins, the medieval or Christian worldview arose on contrary premises. This is the first paragraph about the medieval order within the introduction. And this is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th sentence. It says, not obscure fate to which Zeus and the Olympians had to defer as a higher power, but the rational and moral will of a benevolent divinity was now the ultimate source of order, the ruling arche that accounted for the way the world is. So this is talking about the implications of replacing nature with God as your source of meaning. And particularly, I mean, there's a number of things in it. Fate is capitalized in part because we're referring to the fates, right? Because in the ancient Greek polytheism, the Moirae, the fates, were more powerful than the Olympian gods. Even Zeus was subject to the fates. And of course, as you may recall from a few months ago, there was yet one darker behind even the fates, Ananke, necessity, who even the fates had to bow to. There was this chain of necessity and fate that guided the laws of nature, the lawfulness of nature that we had to align with. And of course, their premise was that rather than being a single source of information, what we had instead were multiple competing arche, multiple competing principles of nature. This is what Heraclitus tells us, that there were fountains of creative order in the universe, and that they are, on the one hand, in conflict with one another. They don't take each other into account. They each generate according to their own principle. But the conflicts that arise between them as a result of their being out of sync with each other get resolved by the tensions being harnessed together to create organic systems of life.
And I was wondering if you, you could copy some of that quote that you started off with and put it in chat.
I'll paste
I'm
that
having
in chat
trouble
right now.
finding it.
Right there. That's the line. And so the reference to arche is incredibly important. Arche were one of the most important concepts in the Greek cosmology. Arche are the principles, and not principles in the modern effete sense of empty ideals. They were principles as in fountains of order, inexorable powers of the cosmos. And the power was not a power of compulsion, but a power of creativity. That things were created in certain directions, that nature was aligned in certain directions. And these different alignments were on the one hand incompatible, but on the other, in combination, they got harnessed to each other to create an ecosystem within which life was not only possible, but inevitable, so that all things were part of a huge living system. And that the duty, therefore, of human culture is to identify these archae, to give them names and characterize them and tell stories about them, eloquent stories, so that even the stupidest person could remember, don't jump off a cliff, don't light yourself on fire. There's basics, right, that they're trying to teach and make sure that everybody's got it. And they're trying to say it eloquently. But fundamental to this is this idea of polytheism, this idea that there are many archae and that they are not all part of, that although they create a unified system, they create it through conflict because they themselves are not originally harmonious. The harmony between them is that together they generate the fate of the cosmos through the powers and the directions that they enforce. You can, at a simplistic noetic way, you can think about it like a vector problem in mathematics. This vector goes this way, this vector goes that way, so when you combine them, you actually end up over here. That's the way they thought about these powers kind of intersecting each other and pushing outcomes in a new direction. So fate.
I'm just going to say that's where I'm at here. So that's what I'm utilising, and I'm having trouble finding where the quote is.
I will jump over there right now and see if I can help you locate the position. Oh, you're in 5. No, we're back up in 2, time, history, and nature.
Oh, okay.
I see what you're asking now.
I see, okay.
Oops. Oh, it says it's lost. Why does it say it's lost? Huh. I think David, we have a dead link. Try Y2K and the conflict of cultures. Oh, it's not getting that one either. Oh, I bet the meetup link has it. Let me go there now and see if I can get there. And it'll just take a moment. Log into Facebook, go. Connect. Millennia Microcosm. Here we are. It's not over yet. Go away. There, end02.php. This is it. Let me give you the link. Oh, yeah. That's it. Yes, thank you. So that's the link to it. And if you just scroll down past ancient to medieval, it's the opening paragraph of medieval, and we're in the fifth sentence, not obscure fate. So the thing about this is that the term fate is related to the lawfulness of nature, the way that the Greeks conceive of it. Mm-hmm. Fate isn't at all what moderns think of as fate. It's not some cruel author wanted to write a certain ending, and so he forced you down a certain road you wouldn't have gone down. They mean that the intersection of the internal lawfulness of your inner nature, your character, when it intersects with the lawfulness of the nature around you and its arcane principles, produce a result that you're fated to walk down. And this includes the possibility of free will, which we'll talk about another time. But that the idea is that figuring out what your fate is a complex problem. And it involves epistemology. It involves all these unknowns. It involves the things you don't know about the core principles of the world around you. And it involves the things you don't know about the core principles inside of you. And if your fate is obscure to you because you are blind to so much of the important parts of these two natures, that what we have are lots of details, like we understand our personality, right? The kinds of things we say, the kinds of foods we like, but we don't understand the character that's underneath that's generating the personality. The character is the arche inside of us, the archi, that together, you know, as fountains of creativity intersecting with each other, generate our personality. And in the same way, the phenomena of the world around us that we put all our value into are the result of the intersections of all these archi in nature outside of us, that in their intersection generate these phenomena. And so you have a nature-based fate, basically, that is obscure, but is not created by one single arche. It is generated by the intersection of many archi in two different domains, the inner domain and the outer domain. Two natures come into conflict to generate this. And so in some sense, it's triply obscure, right? If we just look in our own character, that's obscure. We have a hard time seeing what matters. If we just look in nature, it's obscure. We have a hard time separating the principles from the details. But even if we had both of those, the intersection between the two is so complex that we can't work it out. And so there's a third layer of obscurity. Hence, if people call Heraclitus obscure because he writes about these things. So what we're saying is that the ancients believed that your outcome in life was the result not of any individual, but of the intersection of all these obscure archi. And it was therefore a difficult problem. It's a tough problem, inherently tough. And what the medievals are saying is that's all bunk. That's nonsense. Because there's only one source of meaning. And that one source of meaning is not obscure at all. I mean, yes, God works in mysterious ways, but it's not like you have a whole bunch of archi interacting in complicated ways from two different domains and then intersecting. It is one source. It's a monism. Everything is reduced to one. Instead of infinite, we have one. We only have to know the one, and we can figure out what our fate is. And fortunately for us, the one told us what our fate is. He said, believe in me and you'll be saved, and don't believe in me and you'll burn forever in eternity. Eternal salvation or eternal torture is your fate, one or the other. And the recipe to get from one to the other is really simple. I mean, it may be hard because of our own contrary natures that we have to fight, but the thing that you have to do, the goal, is simple. And so what they've created is they've reduced a sort of infinitely dimensional, obscure problem down to a one-dimensional problem in which you're in the middle and you can either go up or down. And that's all you have to think about is going up instead of going down. And if you just do that one thing, your fate is clear. It's certain. You can know it. I mean, this is where you start to get into arguments with Calvin and Martin Luther and stuff like that about, well, can you really know it? But, you know, the promise is do this and you'll be saved. So you can know it. You just have to do it. I can't begin to explain the complete 100% inversion involved in the change from the ancient view of how principles determine our fate to the to the medieval view of how one source of meaning has laid out your two choices, and all you have to do is choose correctly and work with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul to do that one thing. Right? It is as close to an opposite as you can create, from the infinite to the not only finite, but just the one. And that's the first thing about that. That's incredibly important. This is buried in this sentence. These words, fate and archai, they're incredibly loaded. The more you know about the ancient order, the more you can see what Kenneth Smith is putting at stake here. This is a direct opposition. But there is a second critically important issue, and that is you will never hear Kenneth Smith use the word fate without implying Heraclitus's character is fate. Always. He's always got Heraclitus on the brain. Ethos anthropoi daimon, right? A man's character, or a people's character, or a civilization's character, or an epoch of history's character, is its guardian daimon, its divinity that rules over it and rides it and nudges it through its unconscious desires. So the implication is that if you invest in the development of your character, if you learn what your character is that you were born with, good or bad, it doesn't matter. But whatever state it's in, when you become conscious and aware of it, if you then invest in tailoring it and developing it and disciplining it, you can make it better than it started out being. This is core to the Heraclitean answer to the tension between free will and determinism. They say, you know, it all starts with self-awareness. That's why Gnosis Auton is the one thing, the first and most important thing at the entrance to the oracle at Delphi. Because once you know yourself, you can then begin to shape yourself. And you can shape yourself from even the most abysmal initial state into something much better. Or you could be born with an incredibly lucky character and yet be self-blind and ruin it and descend, right? This is the ancient perspective on human character. And the critical word is daimon, because a daimon is a divinity, but not a divinity that represents the great archai of the universe. It's only the archai of you. It's your archai, your principle that is unfolding to create your choices and your personality. And so it doesn't rule anybody else like a god, but it rules you like a god, you know, a personal god. And what's important about this conception is that during the period of the loss of nerve, when we leave the Hellenic period and enter the Hellenistic Alexandrian period, they begin to lose the faith in that. And they begin to focus on the inevitability of succumbing to whichever kind of daimon you were born with. They stop, you know, as the educational systems fall apart, as the cultural agreement falls apart, they start believing that you can't actually change the character you're born with, and that you're a prisoner of your daimon. And if you're lucky, you have a eudaimon. And that condition, which you'll see alluded to in Plato and elsewhere, is eudaimonia. That you exist in the condition of having a good daimon, and therefore things just work out for you, because there are infinite stupid choices that you just aren't drawn to for whatever, you know, because your daimon doesn't lead that way. But if you're unlucky, you're born with a bad daimon, and that's dysdaimonia. from which we get Othello's Desdemona. And that dysdaimonia means you just have a knack for failure. You just, you pick up the bottle when you should put it down. You just bet your money on the sure thing that isn't a sure thing at all and lose your savings. You just can't seem to stop yourself. You have that instinct for failure. So as they lost faith in the idea of anthropoculture, of conditioning yourself to develop your daimon from whatever state it's in into a better one, they became obsessed with what you were born with. And this is how we saw the rise of astrology. Because astrology promised to predict for you based on the stars which kind of daimon you were born with. And then we would know to send you on a track that was a good track or a track that was a bad track based on how lucky or unlucky you'd happen to be born. So people became really obsessed with this idea of the daimon as a trap instead of as a garden that you could cultivate. And once they got into that mindset, the specific promise of Christianity was that he could drive out demons. Demons, by which we mean daimons. He could drive out the daimon that you were born with and liberate you from its constraints. You could have been a torturer and a liar and a cheat and an adulterer. You could have slept with children. You could do every crime conceivable. But once that evil daimon has been displaced from you, you're now an empty vessel that can receive the Spirit of God. You could now be infinitely good, even if just a second before you were infinitely bad. And so Jesus, the exorcist's promise is that he can free you from the cycles of dysdaimonia by letting God into you. And once God is in you, you get to be rewarded for eternity instead of punished for eternity. So you're not going to see Kenneth Smith write a sentence talking about fate and arche like this without also talking about this particular revolution in the conception of free will and determinism. All you had to do, you no longer had to struggle lifelong to cultivate the rocky soil of your character into something that could flourish. It's so much easier than that. You just have to surrender. Just surrender. This is why Islam means submit. All you have to do is surrender to God's will, and all that hard struggle goes away. This is why it's good news. The good news is the ancient worldview is over. You're no longer a prisoner of your daimon. Jesus will free you of your daimon, and now you can be filled with the Spirit and go live for all eternity with God. That's what's going on in this sentence, this revolution in the concept of free will and determinism. And so when he says the rational and moral will of benevolent divinity, he's saying God is giving us a way out of the trap of the daimons. And what could be better than that? Because when you're looking for an explanation about why the ancient epoch's promise failed, the explanation is that even though people claimed that they ruled because their superior nature gave them the right to rule, the truth, as we discovered over and over in their corruption, was that that was a lie, that they didn't have a superior character. In fact, that people drawn to power often have the worst character, and that the whole thing, the whole promise had collapsed. And where were we supposed to go from here? So this recipe is how it is that medievalism promised we could end the corruption of the city of man and replace it with the city of God. And we do that by driving out the daimons. And we can do that because Jesus has the power of God, because Jesus is an incarnation or an aspect or something of God. He's got God's power. And God's power is more powerful than any other God, more powerful than Zeus, more powerful than Thor, more powerful than your own personal God that rules your character. And therefore, he has the power to free you. These days, we read all the stuff about throwing out of demons, and we think of the movie The Exorcist. We have no idea what he's talking about. We think it's like, wow, they just must have really thought that, all these evil spirits were flying around possessing people. And, in a weird, distorted way, that's not 100% false. It just completely misses the point of what the promise was of the medieval revolution. The promise was to break the cycle. And it offered a supernatural solution because the long 1,000-year period of the ancient epoch was all we needed to demonstrate that we couldn't find a natural solution. If there wasn't a natural solution, the only possibility was we need a supernatural solution, and Christianity offered it. Here's your way out. Here's why you could never solve this problem, and here's why we can. So Phil and then Donald. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, well, thank you for that. That was very, very important because the transition, once again, was very important in terms of setting that up. Because, like, you know, like, it takes time for these transitions to germinate. Like, if I could understand you correctly, the ancients believe in these multiple factors, and that these internal logic is not what we now call logic. So therefore, there needs to be a period, reduction, or what you call destructuring,
Yes.
before you can restructure. And that destructuring is what happens when the Romans adapted the Hellenistic and the Greek idea of this complexities and contradictions and simplify it,
Yeah.
so that it's more efficient to produce a civilization that's efficient and could produce and conquer, actually, in that sense. And so in some sense, that's one of the reasons why, you know, like, oh, the Greeks knew about the, you know, the year, the calendar, and, you know, it's so complicated, 365 and a quarter days. I mean, what's the sense of a quarter? Let's just reduce it to 365. Good enough. It works. It's functional. It works. Okay. So the simplification, because we're busy administering the empire, right? And so once that reduction happened, then you could then, in a sense, wedge in a reconstruction by that simplicity.
Right.
And that simplicity was, oh no, once we replace this reductive absurdum,
yes,
by a transcendental power. And
yes,
I like the idea that you creep in the word will, the will of God.
yes,
The will
yes.
of God will supersede all of this, and it's quite simple, right?
Exactly.
Just follow the will of God, and all these other diversities that appears to be diversities, they are kind of pretty much nonsense. Just go along with it. And so therefore, now what you have when you get back to the modern is the will remains as the dominant force. And
exactly.
It's really, really, I think, in many ways, a very genius move, but it took a destructuring before you could reconstructure. And that destructuring took time, like I said, Alexander, you know, to Caesar, to Augustus, and so forth, and the emperors. And then finally, that too deteriorated, and then now the kingdom of God could take over. The real will that's behind all this, not this sort of fake will of the Superman.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, thank you. I think that, but what I'm saying is, once again, the structure is there to see the contrast, but the transition need to destructure before you could reconstruct a simple model.
That's right.
Of the forms.
You know, and hand in hand with that, it's a way in which, in some ways, the fall of Rome was a blessing for Christianity. Because, I mean, sure, nominally, the Roman Empire had become Christian, but it was still a carryover of the ancient structures and not actually a medieval structure at all. And so once it fell, then the church could begin building a new empire that was organized, centered on Christianity, instead of merely tolerating or officially recognizing Christianity. You know, what Charlemagne promised the Pope was, you know, you'll be determining the secular structure from now on. You aren't going to be saddled with some pre-existing secular structure carrying over its corruption from an old, you know, corrupt epoch. We can start from scratch and build something clean, just the way you want it. So, you know, that goes hand in hand with what you said, that idea of we have to finish destructing the old structures in order to begin reconstructing And it's weird. You're right. It's weird how the will of the ancient world gets transmuted into the will of God in the medieval world, which gets transmuted into the will of man in the modern world. It's the thing that carries through, but in a completely different form in each epoch. By the time, all the reconstructions have happened in our conception of the things that matter, once we're deep into an epoch, it's a whole different game, even though it grew right out of the previous one. Donald and then Stephen. Go ahead, Donald.
First, I think you implied it, but I just want to make it explicit that the ancient archae were immanent within nature.
Yes.
And this new archae is transcendent to nature.
Exactly.
So again, all these same words have different meanings.
Yes.
That are quite important. And just since we've done the ancients and we're working on the medievals, there is a book. So it's a fiction book, but I think it's of Per Lagerkvist, yes, The Sibyl. It's just a conversation. It's a fictional conversation between a Pythia for Apollo at Delphi, who is talking to a man that was given eternal life as Jesus was hauling his cross up the hill to be crucified. He leaned against, he was kind of rude to Jesus, and Jesus says, "You'll have everlasting life and no peace." And so these two immortals, since they've got plenty of time, eventually find each other and just sit for an afternoon and have a conversation.
Yes.
Both as one kind of being the Christian, although not a good Christian, and the other being a Pythia to Apollo, who got eternal life from Apollo. And they're sort of different views.
Who's the author?
Per Lagerkvist. It's my Swedish is terrible. I thought I could pronounce some of these things, but
Lagerkvist. Ah, I see it now.
Kvist. Yeah.
I'll put a
Yeah,
little
he
link.
wrote. It's when you
I should
meet.
read that.
Yeah, it's a very short story. You can read it in a couple of hours probably, but it's just an interesting conversation, not at the depth of Kenneth's contrasting. It's not, but it is. They're just talking about their lives and stuff like that, and what it was like to meet a divinity and how the divinities differ and stuff like that.
It's interesting.
I think it's an interesting story so I recommend it
I'll read it
to people. I reread it as we got into this because I don't think I knew about it until following Kenneth through some bookstore. He pulled it off the shelf and put it on my stack and said, "Buy this." And then when I read it, I said, "Wow, this is really good." And I reread it just recently, and I still think it's really good because both are I think good at representing the different viewpoints of the ancient and the Christian medieval.
Right.
view. And that's enough again.
Thank you for that. I will chase that down. I'm a real fan of works that try their best to put completely different perspectives side by side and let them have a conversation. There's one of the parables that that Kenneth Smith wrote is a conversation between Jesus and Prometheus, where Jesus is there to offer solace to Prometheus in his agonies, with the eagle tearing at his liver. And they have a conversation about what it is to be divine and what it is to deal with mortals. It's just, it's not as long as the Sibyl, but it's quite enjoyable. Stephen, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
I find it a bit tiresome, the attacks on Heidegger. What really annoys me is that so many people just don't know history at all.
Right.
Very limited. In history, you read it, you discover there's a lot of big questions. And one of the hugest mistakes people make is to view history in hindsight.
Yes. I agree. So Steve, go ahead.
He went with the, oh, did you lose me?
Just for a moment, but you're back.
Well, Heidegger went with the Nazis for a year or something, or apparently did, and that's almost nothing.
Mm-hmm.
People view history in hindsight.
Right.
You have to take yourself back to that moment, history, and put yourself in the shoes of the year 1930.
Right.
Or something like that.
Right.
But the big problem is they say Heidegger sins. They seem to always look for the black card, oh, Heidegger, you've got a splinter in your eye, while ignoring the very beam that's stuck in their own eyes. And their big problem is that, Heidegger and the Nazis sins by the standards of Christian civilization.
Sure.
But the present people are saying that Christianity is evil. I mean, okay, what are the Nazis now evil in relation to? If you're throwing Christianity out the window, which pervaded everything, which Nietzsche saw the danger.
Yes.
He saw even the worst form of Christianity is still better keeping if we can.
Sure.
Because what are we going to turn to then? Now, the humanists are claiming man is good, man is God. Therefore, man is inherently moral unless there's some sort of sick machine. Right. This was the point Stirner attacked. You're trying to make man a God to replace the other one?
It doesn't work.
Yeah, well, where are the humanists now in their project of man is God, therefore he's moral, therefore he can be perfect?
Yeah.
Because from the standpoints of Darwinistic science, I can't see a great problem with the Nazis. I can see a problem in relation to Christianity. Yeah, sure. But where are we now?
Yeah, what's the frame of reference for meaning? And of course, this is Kenneth Smith's critique of the modern world, drawing off of Nietzsche and others, is that we have torpedoed all our basis for establishing meaning. The premise of the modern world is, let's not argue about those things. Let's just do what's practical. And of course, that just opens up it just opens up a whole can of worms and problems. So before I go on to Donald, I'm going to ask both James and Stephen. Stephen first. Do you have a favorite work by Heidegger that you'd recommend that I read first?
I haven't studied him.
Okay. Thanks, Stephen. James, do you have a favorite work by Heidegger?
No, I'm still going through the Being and Time, and I think it's pretty fascinating.
I can start with that one.
Trying to grapple with that, yeah.
Thank you. All right, and we're going to have to wrap up, but I see Donald's got his hand up, and I'm looking forward to this. So go ahead, Donald. What do we got?
Oh, there's one of my professors told me a story about Hegel, that he's delivering a lecture at some point during the Napoleonic Wars.
Yes. And
Napoleon's army passes through town. And as they pass through town, Hegel stops his lecture and says, the world spirit just rode by on his horse. So we don't tend to disparage Hegel because he said something somewhat admiring of Napoleon.
Right.
Yeah, you know.
Right.
I mean, I think Hegel, in a sense, Heidegger might have been right. The Nazis represented some new view onto what being was for us, that it's opened up something that it's a can of worms that we haven't opened before. And therefore, we can't be philosophers without recognizing it.
Right.
That's not to say we can be philosophers and not approve of it, but we certainly need, if we can't see something new that's about ourselves, something new that man has learned about himself, we're either existentialist or we're deluded.
Right.
And so when we say this is impossible and then it happens, well, hold my beer, watch this.
Right. Right.
And
yeah. Go ahead.
No, I'm finished.
Yeah, I agree with what both of you have said, and you know what we're going to explore in depth over the course of this book is partly what you've said, Donald, and partly what you've said, Stephen, which is, you know, we have to be able to recognize the big movements and what they teach us. That's part of what I love about Hannah Arendt's writings about the Nazis, but also about totalitarianism generally, is what are the lessons we can learn from these big movements that have happened, because they mean something. They're not just something to cancel. They're something to study and to try to figure out, what does this teach us about the human condition or about the modern epoch. But as part of that, you know, I especially want to zero in on what Stephen said, which is that there is, as Nietzsche observed, this enormous gaping abyss in the place where our standards for ethics ought to be. What is our basis for deciding right from wrong? It is the Achilles heel of modernism, that it purports to dispense with all such traditional things and supernatural things and complicated philosophical things, and says we'll just focus on what's practical. You know, we'll be utilitarian, we'll be pragmatic. But of course, in the course of saying that, while claiming to be answering those questions, what it's actually doing is deferring them and making it almost impossible to answer them. And thus we end up with you know, Stephen's correct question, which is, if we don't like what the Nazis did, what is our moral basis for saying so? What is our moral framework by which we're judging them? Because, you know, one thing you can say about the medieval era, it had a very clear moral framework. Even the Reformation, even Martin Luther, all of those critiques against the corruption of the medieval era used the ethical system of the medieval era to critique it, right? Because it had a framework. But when it comes to modernism, how do we critique things that we feel went wrong? And the answer is incoherently. As Kenneth Smith says, we critique modern developments using the shards of earlier epochs that had moral standards. And we don't recognize that that's what we're doing. And we mistake those critiques for modern critiques because we don't know what it is to be modern. We don't understand ourselves.
I'm a bit frightened of a humanity that thinks they shit gold bricks.
Right. Yeah, the hubris involved is just begging for the fall that follows, right? Yeah. Phil, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, once again, I'm also a beginner reading Being and Time. And about Heidegger, I am actually, on the one hand, very allured by what he says about Dasein. Okay, that he's just very, very refined and nuanced in his writing.
Yeah.
But I am concerned about Dasein's resoluteness to find his yet-to-be self. And I wonder how that wraps around and becomes more ethical in relationship to care, and guilt.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering whether that resoluteness in its manifestation of his yet-to-be self will not in some way cross over the line of ethics in terms of care for otherness. I'm waiting to see what he says, okay? But I think, Emmanuel Levinas, who was a Jewish philosopher, which I even know less about, did follow after Heidegger and wrote about otherness, right?
Yes.
And about the meta ethics, ethics of I think of care. And I think that might be in his own way a criticism of Heidegger. I don't know. So I have to see that maybe that you could step over the line when your resoluteness to resolve yourself into your future self might blindside you. And because I wonder whether that turn him into being in favor of the Nazis, or what, historically and what happened. He did withdraw, so it wasn't like he stayed with it.
Right.
Because that resoluteness had a sound of the final solution, right? The final solution of Dasein is to be resolute in his caring for his yet to be self. So I'm waiting, because if anybody will get out of it, he can. But I am concerned with that degree of resoluteness and self-determination.
So I'll start digging into Heidegger, because it's a bigger blind spot than most in my reading, and I think I'll read Being and Time second. I had downstairs. I have one of Heidegger's 2 books on Heraclitus.
Yeah,
that will make an
also
excellent
reading
place
that
for me to start, because I know Heraclitus so well.
Mm-hmm.
I can see, what does Heidegger see when he looks at Heraclitus. That'll tell me a lot about Heidegger. So I'll start there and then move on to Being in Time. I just finished reading Gilbert Murray's Rise of the Greek Epic. That's one of the books that Kenneth Smith always recommends for understanding Western civilization and the Greeks in particular. The link I shared there is to the Internet Archive. It's gone into the public domain, so you can get Rise of the Greek Epic for free from that link at the Internet Archive. Just click on it, or if you want to make a small donation to keep the Internet Archive running, so they can give us more things like this, then feel free. They've got buttons at the top of the page. But anyone who wants to copy that link out, you should do that now before we wrap up. I just finished reading it. I thought I was reading it for the first time, and I went to go Google something that I'd said before on my blog, and I discovered that I read it before in 2006, or rather I skimmed it in 2006 and seized on one section and then got lost. So now I went back and reread it from the beginning, and I really love it. It's full of good stuff. So anyway, there's that for those of you who want it. And meanwhile, why don't we wrap up for this week? We'll continue with. I'm going to type OK to tell David he can close it out when he's ready to. But we'll continue with the medieval section next week, and I hope you're finding this as interesting as I am, because the medieval epoch is as interesting as it is as a period in its own. It's so much more interested when it's set in juxtaposition against the era that it was trying to shake free from. And why was it trying to shake free from it? And what did it change? It's like you start to see the bud to the blossom, of Hegel in the history when you look at it this way, which is where ultimately this is all coming from.
Very much so. Thank you. Thank you.
My sincere
Thank
pleasure.
you, Rick. Hi, Joseph.
Hi, Jenny. Thank you,
Thank
Rick.
you, Rick.
Thank you as
Bye.
always.
Bye.
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Oh, yeah,
Yes.
everybody. Yeah, happy Thanksgiving to you.
Have a
Thank you,
great week.
David.
Thank you, David.